My parents sold my 9-year-old son's antique piano, the one his great-grandfather gave him, for $97,000. They used the money to build a home theater for my sister's kid. When Grandpa William found out, he didn't yell, he didn't cry. He didn't even raise his voice. He just smiled. The kind of smile that makes you check if the doors are locked. And he said, "That piano." My parents' faces turned pale. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But I would. Everyone would. This is the story of how my family tried to erase my son, how they stole his inheritance and turned it into a cinema for a child who already had everything, and how my 72-year-old grandfather made sure they would never forget what they'd done. Some lessons come late, some debts get collected with interest, and some old men have been waiting decades for their children to show their true colors. I knew something was wrong before we even pulled into the driveway. You can smell a renovation the way you can smell a lie. There's something sharp underneath, something that doesn't belong, something that tells you money has been spent without your knowledge. Ethan sat in the back seat, his music folder on his lap, his small metronome tucked into the front pocket of his backpack. He was humming under his breath, the way he always did when he was happy. Chopin. The nocturne his great-grandfather taught him last spring. His fingers tapped rhythms on his knee. Already halfway into that focused little world he disappeared into whenever music was involved. "Do you think Grandpa will come visit today?" he asked, pulling his ponytail tighter like he could control the universe with elastic. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "He's settling into his new place, remember? The senior community. But we can call him later if you want." Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed hopeful anyway. Like maybe William had changed his mind overnight and driven back to the house just to hear him practice. My son had a gift for believing in people who actually deserved it. It was the people who didn't deserve it that worried me. "Mom?" His voice was smaller now. "Why does Grandma always ask about Jaden's grades but never about my recitals?" I didn't have a good answer for that. I'd been asking myself the same question for 9 years. "Grandma's just busy," I said. The lie tasted like dust. Ethan didn't push. He never did. That was the problem. We turned onto my parents' street, and that's when I saw the truck. A big white contractor's vehicle with a construction company logo on the side, parked right in the driveway like it owned the place. Behind it, a stack of materials sat by the garage. Wood, insulation, something wrapped in plastic that looked expensive. I pulled to the curb and cut the engine. The smell hit me the moment I opened my door. Fresh paint, sawdust. That sharp chemical tang of new things being built on top of old secrets. Maybe they're fixing the music room. Ethan was already unbuckling, his face bright with possibility. Grandpa always said it needed better lighting. I didn't answer. My gut was already tightening, already sensing what my brain refused to acknowledge. We walked up to the front door. I had a key. Not because I was especially trusted, but because I was useful. There's a difference. One gets you love. The other gets you access codes and errands. I'd learned to stop confusing the two around the time Ethan was born. The second I opened the door, I heard it. Power tools. Muffled but unmistakable. Coming from the back of the house, from the direction of the formal living room. And beneath that sound, voices, laughter, the comfortable chatter of people spending money they hadn't earned. Ethan tiptoed inside like he was entering a museum. The entryway had been transformed. Tarps covered the hallway runner. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. Someone had taped off sections with blue painter's tape, which in my family was a polite way of saying, "Don't touch anything, peasant." "What's going on?" Ethan whispered. I shook my head and kept walking. We passed the family photos on the wall. I'd stopped counting years ago how few of them included Ethan. My sister Melissa's son Jaden dominated every surface. Soccer trophies, school portraits, vacation snapshots from beaches I'd never been invited to visit. And Ethan? One photo, from 3 Christmases ago, partially hidden behind a decorative plant. The noise grew louder as we approached the back of the house. I could see it now through the archway. where my parents' formal living room used to be, where Clara's piano had sat for as long as I could remember, was now a construction zone. Workers in paint-spattered clothes moved with purpose. One of them carried a speaker the size of a small refrigerator. Another adjusted something on the ceiling, some kind of mount. And against the far wall, where the antique Bösendorfer had rested for decades, I saw a massive screen being installed. Projection equipment, acoustic panels, leather seats stacked in the corner, still wrapped in plastic. A home theater, a full professional home theater, right where my son's piano used to live. Whoa! Ethan's eyes went wide. Is this for movie nights? There was so much hope in his voice that I actually hated everyone I was related to in that moment. I don't know, I said carefully. Let's find your piano first. I pulled him away from the construction, toward the hallway, toward the music room where the Bösendorfer was supposed to be. The room William had set up specifically for Ethan's practice. Climate-controlled, humidity monitored. A lock on the door because my grandfather wasn't born yesterday. The door was open, the humidifier was still running, the sheet music was still on the shelves. William's old reading chair still sat in the corner. But the corner where the piano lived, where Ethan's piano rested like it belonged to him, like it had been waiting his whole life for him to grow into it, was empty, not moved, not covered, empty, just carpet indentations where the legs used to press down, marks from decades of sitting in one sacred spot, a ghost of something that was supposed to be permanent. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't even inhale. He just froze. Then he walked to the corner slowly, like approaching a wound, like if he moved too fast he might make it worse. He touched the wall where the piano used to lean, looked behind the chair, under the shelf, searching for something that logic told him couldn't be there, but hope demanded he look for anyway. Then he turned to me. Did Grandpa change his mind? His voice was small, careful, like he was afraid to disturb the air, like the question itself might get him in trouble, not angry. That would have been easier. Angry I could have worked with. But this quiet acceptance, this assumption that he'd done something wrong, that he'd somehow earned being forgotten, this broke me. No, I said, and my throat was so tight the word barely escaped. Grandpa did not change his mind. Ethan nodded once, too hard, like he was forcing the moment to behave. His fingers drifted to the edge of the music stand, reaching for keys that weren't there. When he felt nothing, he pulled his hand back fast like he'd touched a hot stove. His eyes got glossy, but nothing fell. 9 years old, and he'd already learned to hold it in. I noticed something else missing then. The framed photograph that always sat on the piano. William and Clara on their wedding day, standing beside the Bösendorfer, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what their family would become. That was gone too. I knelt beside Ethan, gripped his shoulders, made him look at me. Grandpa did not change his mind, I repeated. Do you understand me? He loves you. He would never take the piano back. Then where is it? I didn't have an answer, not yet. But I could feel where this was heading, and every instinct I had was screaming that my son was standing in the middle of something ugly that I should have seen coming. Stay here, I told him. I'm going to find out what happened. I left him in the empty music room because I needed him not to see my face when I found out the truth. I could feel the anger building, but it wasn't hot. It was cold, the kind of cold that burned slow and didn't stop. I walked toward the kitchen. I'd spent 31 years being the good daughter, the one who didn't make waves, the one who let Melissa shine and Patricia control and Richard dismiss. I'd swallowed so much for the sake of family peace that I'd forgotten what my own voice sounded like. But my son was in that room right now, blaming himself for something he didn't do, teaching himself for the 100th time that he wasn't important enough to protect. That ended today. I reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. My mother sat at the table, phone in one hand, coffee mug in the other. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup perfect, her expression the carefully constructed mask of a woman who believed she was always right. My father scrolled through something on his tablet, calm as a man who'd never been told no in his life. And Melissa, my sister, perched on a stool by the counter, sipping something green and expensive, her designer bag hanging off her shoulder like a badge of honor. None of them looked up when I entered. I stepped into the kitchen. Where is Ethan's piano? My mother's cup froze halfway to her lips. My father's finger paused mid-scroll. And, Melissa? She smiled. That smile told me everything I needed to know. And nothing I wanted to hear. The kitchen went silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence between people who understand each other, the sharp kind. The kind that happens when someone asks a question nobody wants to answer. My mother set down her coffee cup with a careful clink. Her smile was back, but it didn't reach her eyes. It never did when she was about to lie. Good morning to you too, Amanda. I didn't move, didn't smile back, didn't give her the satisfaction of pretending this was a normal Saturday. I said, where is Ethan's piano? My father sighed. The sound of a man who believed the world should rearrange itself around his comfort. He set down his tablet and looked at me the way he'd looked at me my entire life, like I was a minor inconvenience between him and something more important. What's the problem now? The problem. Like my son's missing inheritance was a scheduling conflict. Like $97,000 of family history had simply been misplaced. The piano, I repeated. The Bosendorfer, Great-Grandma Clara's piano, the one Grandpa William gave to Ethan. Where is it? Melissa snorted without looking up from her phone. Oh, please! My mother took another sip of her coffee. Slow, deliberate, the gesture of a woman who controlled every room she entered. Your father handled it. Handled it. That phrase had followed me through my entire childhood. Your father handled the college fund. Your father handled the inheritance split. Your father handled why Melissa got the new car and you got the used one. Handled was my family's favorite word for decisions made without my input or consent. Handled it how? My father finally looked up. His expression was calm, patient, the mask of a man who'd never been seriously challenged in his life. We sold it. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I felt the impact in my chest before my brain could process what he'd said. You sold it? Yes. He said it like he was explaining basic math to a slow child. It was valuable. It was sitting there. Your grandfather wasn't even using it. Nobody was using it. Ethan was using it. My voice came out sharper than I intended. He practiced on it every Saturday. He was using it today until he walked in and found it gone. My mother waved a hand dismissively. Amanda, don't start. Don't start. Another family favorite. Don't start meant shut up. Don't start meant your feelings are inconvenient. Don't start meant we already did what we wanted, and we're not interested in your opinion. Don't start, I repeated. You sold my son's piano, the piano his great-grandfather specifically gave to him, and you're telling me not to start? My father leaned back in his chair. It was a family asset. We made a practical decision. A family asset. I tasted the words, and they burned. That's not what Grandpa William called it. He called it Ethan's inheritance. He put it in writing. Something flickered across my mother's face. Just for a second. Something that looked almost like fear. Your grandfather says a lot of things, she said smoothly. He's getting older, sentimental. You know how he is? I knew exactly how he was. William Collins was the sharpest person in any room he entered. He'd been running his own business until 5 years ago. He played chess 3 times a week and won more often than not. The idea that he was some confused old man making promises he couldn't keep was absurd, and my mother knew it. But she was betting I wouldn't push. She was betting 31 years of conditioning would keep me quiet. She was wrong. How much? My father raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. How much did you sell it for? The Bosendorfer, 1893 Imperial Grand. How much? He actually smiled, proud of himself. $97,000. Cash wire. The collector was very motivated. Quick sale, no hassle. $97,000. My son's inheritance, reduced to a transaction. And what did you do with the money? Melissa finally looked up from her phone. Her smile was back, the one she'd worn in the kitchen doorway, the one that said she knew something I didn't. We invested it in the family, my mother said, in the children. Which children? Nobody answered immediately, and in that silence, I heard the construction noise from the back of the house, the power tools, the workers installing the massive screen where Clara's piano used to sit. The home theater, I said. It wasn't a question. You sold Ethan's piano to build Jaden a home theater. My mother's chin lifted. The children deserve nice things. Which children? I asked again. Because I'm looking at a $97,000 movie room, and I'm not seeing anything that belongs to Ethan. Melissa set down her green juice with a sharp click. Jaden has been asking for a proper entertainment space for years. He has friends. He needs somewhere to socialize, unlike some kids who just sit in corners and play scales all day. I turned to my sister. We were only 3 years apart, but sometimes it felt like we'd grown up in different families. In a way we had. She'd grown up golden. I'd grown up useful. Ethan is 9 years old. He's a child. And you just funded your son's entertainment room with his inheritance. It's not like that, my mother interjected. Ethan can use the theater too. He can watch movies with Jaden. It'll be good for him. Good for him. My son's piano sold so he could watch movies in a room he was never invited to. Besides, my father added, you can rent a piano. Plenty of kids practice on rentals. It's not like he's going to be a concert pianist. The casualness of it stunned me. The absolute certainty that Ethan's dreams weren't worth protecting. That his talent wasn't worth investing in. That everything that mattered to him could be replaced with something cheaper because he wasn't important enough for the real thing. Clara's piano was irreplaceable, I said quietly. It was in our family for over 100 years. Her grandmother bought it for her wedding. It survived 2 world wars and a cross-country move. And you sold it because Jaden wanted a bigger TV. You're being dramatic. My mother's voice had that edge now, the one that meant she was losing patience with my existence. This is exactly why we didn't involve you in the decision. You always make everything so emotional. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound came out harsh and broken. You didn't involve me because you knew I'd say no. You didn't involve Grandpa William because you knew he'd stop you. The fear flickered across my mother's face again. This time it stayed longer. Speaking of which, I continued, does he know? Does Grandpa know you sold Clara's piano? The kitchen went very still. My father and mother exchanged a glance, the kind of glance that said they'd discussed this exact scenario, the kind that told me everything about how deliberate their betrayal had been. Your grandfather doesn't need to know, my mother said carefully. He's settling into his new place. The doctors said he needs calm, stability. We don't want to upset him. The doctors said that? Or you did? Amanda. My father's voice carried a warning now. We're telling you how it's going to be. Dad doesn't need the stress. His heart isn't what it used to be. If you go running to him with this, you'll be the one who hurts him. Is that what you want? There it was. The threat wrapped in concern. The manipulation disguised as care. If I told Grandpa William, I'd be the villain. I'd be the one who caused his heart attack. I'd be responsible for whatever happened next. It was the same playbook they'd used my entire life. Do something wrong. Demand silence. Make the victim feel guilty for being hurt. It had worked before. Every single time. I'd swallowed my anger and kept the peace and told myself that family mattered more than fairness. But I wasn't looking at my family anymore. I was looking at the people who'd stolen from my son. I'm calling him, I said. My mother stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Absolutely not. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. Amanda, think about what you're doing. She moved toward me, hands raised like she was trying to calm a wild animal. We're your parents. We did this for everyone, for the family. If you go to your grandfather, you'll tear us apart. You tore us apart when you sold a 9-year-old's piano to build a cinema for his cousin. Melissa's voice cut in from behind me. God, you're so jealous. You've always been jealous. Of me, of Jaden, of everything I have. This is just your way of getting back at us. I turned to my sister, really looked at her. The designer clothes, the expensive haircut, the absolute certainty that she deserved everything she had, even when it was stolen from a child. This isn't about jealousy, I said. This is about the fact that you took something that didn't belong to you, something that belonged to Ethan, and you didn't even have the decency to tell him first. He's 9, he'll get over it. He thought Grandpa William changed his mind about him. He thought his great-grandfather stopped loving him. He's in that empty room right now wondering what he did wrong. For just a moment, something flickered across Melissa's face, something that might have been shame, but it was gone before I could be sure, replaced by the defensive anger I knew so well. That's not our problem. You're his mother. You explain it to him. I stared at her, at all of them. My mother with her careful mask, my father with his dismissive calm, my sister with her designer indifference. These were the people who were supposed to love me, supposed to love my son, and they'd sold his inheritance without a second thought because Jaden wanted something nicer. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. Amanda! My mother's voice followed me. Amanda, don't you dare! I didn't stop. I walked down the hall, past the family photos that didn't include my son, past the construction noise that used to be silence, back to the music room where Ethan waited. He was still there, sitting on the floor now, his music folder open on his lap. Sheet music for the Chopin Nocturne he'd been planning to practice. The piece his great-grandfather taught him, the piece he'd never play on Clara's piano again. He looked up when I entered. His eyes were dry, but I could see the effort it was taking. They sold it, didn't they? Not a question, a statement, like he'd already known and was just waiting for confirmation. How did you know? He shrugged, too small, too resigned for a 9-year-old. Aunt Melissa told Jaden last week. Jaden told me at school. He looked down at his sheet music. He said I wouldn't need it anymore anyway. My heart cracked clean in two. You knew for a week? You didn't tell me? Another shrug. I didn't want to make trouble. Didn't want to make trouble. 9 years old and already convinced that his pain was less important than everyone else's comfort. That speaking up would only make things worse. That the best thing he could do was be small and quiet and invisible. I knelt beside him and pulled him into my arms. He didn't resist, but he didn't melt into me either. He stayed stiff, controlled, protecting himself even from comfort. Jaden said something else, he mumbled into my shoulder. What? He said Grandpa probably wanted to get rid of it anyway. He said old people forget who they love. I held him tighter, felt the anger building in my chest, colder and harder than anything I'd felt before. That's not true, I said. Grandpa William loves you more than anything. He didn't forget. He didn't change his mind. He didn't know this was happening. Ethan pulled back and looked at me, his grandfather's eyes, Clara's eyes, steady and old and far too wise for 9 years. Are you going to tell him? I thought about the threats, the manipulation, the guilt they'd tried to load onto my shoulders. I thought about my father's warning that I'd be the one to hurt William, that I'd be responsible for whatever happened next. And then I thought about my son, sitting in an empty room, blaming himself for someone else's cruelty, learning one more time that he wasn't worth protecting. Yes, I said, I'm going to tell him everything. Ethan nodded slowly. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, Good. We walked out of the music room together, past the construction, past the kitchen where I could hear my mother's voice rising in agitation, past the front door and into the sunlight. I buckled Ethan into the car, got behind the wheel, started the engine. As I pulled away from the house, I saw my mother appear in the doorway, Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking. Good. Tonight I would call Grandpa William. I would tell him everything. And whatever happened after that, whatever bridges burned and whatever relationships shattered, I would not let my son grow up believing he didn't matter. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan stared out the window, watching the house disappear. Mom? Yes, baby? What if Grandma and Grandpa get really mad? I gripped the steering wheel and thought about every slight, every dismissal, every stolen moment. Then, they'll finally know how it feels. Ethan nodded slowly. And for the first time all day, something in his face relaxed. We drove toward home. Toward the phone call that would change everything. Toward the moment my family would learn that silence has a price. And they'd just run out of credit. The apartment felt smaller when we got home. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The walls seemed closer. The silence seemed louder. Even the light coming through the windows seemed tired. Ethan walked past his keyboard without looking at it. The $60 Yamaha I'd bought from a garage sale 2 years ago, the one he practiced on when we couldn't make it to my parents' house. It wasn't the same as Clara's Bosendorfer. It wasn't even close. But it was what I could afford after the divorce, and Ethan had never once complained. He went straight to his room and closed the door. Not a slam, just a click. That quiet click was worse than any tantrum. It was the sound of a child who'd learned that big emotions weren't welcome. I stood alone in the kitchen. The counter was covered with bills I'd been avoiding. The refrigerator hummed its familiar song. Everything was exactly as we'd left it this morning, and yet nothing was the same. I looked at the table where Ethan had left his music folder. It was open to the Chopin Nocturne, the piece he'd been planning to practice. In the margin, in Grandpa William's careful handwriting, was a note. For my Ethan, play this when you miss me. My throat tightened. I pressed my palm against my eyes and forced myself to breathe. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The apartment stayed silent. I walked to Ethan's door and knocked softly. Honey, can I come in? A pause. Then, okay. Not yes, just okay. Permission without enthusiasm. I opened the door. His room was small but tidy, organized with the precision of a child who'd learned that taking up too little space was safer than taking up too much. Posters of classical composers covered one wall. Chopin, Debussy, Beethoven. A gift from Grandpa William for his 7th birthday. Ethan sat on his bed, holding something in his hands. A photograph. I recognized it immediately. It was from his first recital 2 years ago. Ethan and William at the piano, their heads bent together, matching smiles on their faces. The only recital anyone had attended. Just Grandpa. Just him. Do you think he'll be mad at me? Ethan asked without looking up. Who? Grandpa? He nodded. For losing it. The piano. My heart splintered into pieces I wasn't sure I could ever put back together. You didn't lose anything. I sat beside him on the bed. It was taken. That's not the same thing. Ethan shrugged. That terrible small shrug again. It's gone either way, right? I wanted to scream. Not at him. At everyone who'd taught him that his pain didn't matter. At myself, for letting it happen. Ethan, look at me. He raised his eyes. William's eyes. Clara's eyes. The same quiet depth that saw everything and said very little. None of this is your fault. Do you understand? You didn't do anything wrong. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Not really. 9 years of being overlooked had taught him something different. I remembered when it started. The moment I should have seen the pattern and didn't, or maybe I did see it and chose not to look. 2 years ago. Ethan's 7th birthday. I'd planned a party. Nothing fancy, just family. I'd ordered a cake shaped like a piano keyboard, bought decorations in his favorite colors, sent invitations to everyone even though everyone was really just my parents, Melissa, Derek, and Jaden. The morning of the party, my mother called. We need to reschedule, she said. No greeting, no apology, just the announcement. Reschedule? Mom, the party is today. The cake is ready. Ethan's been counting down for weeks. Jaden has his championship soccer game this afternoon. You understand, right? This is important for his future. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The one that always came when my family asked me to make myself smaller. But it's Ethan's birthday. Amanda. My mother's sigh was the sound of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. Birthdays happen every year. Championships don't. Melissa already told everyone to come to the game instead. You can do the party next weekend. Mom, I can't just... It's handled. We'll see you at the field at 2. Ethan likes soccer, doesn't he? Ethan didn't like soccer. He'd never shown any interest in sports at all. But that didn't matter to my mother. What Ethan liked had never mattered to my mother. I hung up and stood there, trying to figure out how to tell my 7-year-old that his birthday had been canceled for his cousin's soccer game. I didn't have to tell him. He'd been standing in the hallway, listening. He wore his pajamas and his bedhead, and his eyes were too old for his face. "It's okay, Mom," he said. "We can do it later." He said it like he meant it, like he'd already learned that his things could be moved, his moments could be postponed, his joy could wait for more important people. The party never happened. Next weekend became next month, and next month became, we'll do something special for Christmas. And Christmas came and went without anyone mentioning the birthday that got erased. Ethan never asked about it again. He just stopped expecting. But someone remembered. That afternoon, while we were supposed to be at Jaden's soccer game, Grandpa William showed up at our apartment. He had a small cake in one hand and a wrapped present in the other. "I heard there was a birthday happening," he said, winking at Ethan. "Mind if I crash the party?" They spent the whole afternoon together, playing piano, eating cake, talking about music and composers and all the things Ethan loved that nobody else had time for. When William left that evening, Ethan hugged him so hard I thought he might break. The present that day was a book of Chopin nocturnes, the same book that was now sitting on my kitchen table with William's note in the margin. I looked at my son now, still holding that photograph, still blaming himself for something he didn't do. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why didn't you tell me? When Jaden told you about the piano, why didn't you come to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to make you sad. You already had a lot of things to worry about, with the job and the bills and everything." 9 years old, protecting his mother from his own pain, swallowing his grief so I wouldn't have to carry it. "Ethan, you never have to protect me like that. Your feelings matter, your sadness matters, you matter." He looked up at me. "Do I?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "Of course you do." "Then why doesn't anyone else think so?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, and it was too ugly to say out loud. Because our family was broken, because they'd picked their favorites a long time ago, and Ethan wasn't on the list. Because I'd spent years trying to keep the peace instead of fighting for my son. I thought about his recital, 8 months ago, the winter concert at the community center. Ethan had been practicing for weeks, Chopin again. The nocturne William had taught him. He was so nervous and so proud and so desperate for someone to witness what he could do. I invited everyone, my parents, Melissa, Derek, Jaden. I called and texted and reminded them 3 times. "It would mean so much to him," I said. "Please." My mother said she'd try, but December was so busy. My father mentioned something about golf. Melissa promised to send Jaden's nanny to record it, then forgot. Nobody came. The community center had plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, and a piano that was only slightly out of tune. Ethan sat backstage in his one nice shirt, the one we'd bought together at the thrift store. He'd combed his hair with water. He looked like a tiny gentleman waiting for his moment. Every time the door opened, his eyes jumped to it. Every time it wasn't them, his shoulders dropped a little more. 5 minutes before his turn, the door opened one last time. Grandpa William walked in using his cane, moving slowly but deliberately. He found a seat in the front row, waved at Ethan, and Ethan's whole face changed, like someone had turned on a light that had been off for a very long time. He played beautifully that night. Not perfect, but real. The notes filled the small room, and I watched my son perform for an audience of one person who actually wanted to be there. Afterward, William hugged him for a long time. He whispered something in Ethan's ear that I couldn't hear. Later in the car, I asked what Grandpa had said. Ethan smiled. He said the piano will always be mine, no matter what. I'd thought it was sweet, a grandfather reassuring his great-grandson. Now I realized it was a promise, and a warning. There was something else that night. As we walked to our cars, William put his hand on my arm. "Amanda, I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" "If they ever try to take what's his, you call me, day or night. Don't try to handle it yourself, call me." I'd laughed. "They wouldn't do that, Grandpa." He didn't laugh. His eyes were serious in a way I'd rarely seen. "Promise me, Amanda." I promised, without understanding, without believing I'd ever need to keep it. I should have known better. William always understood our family better than I did. He'd been watching them for 40 years. He knew what they were capable of. I looked at Ethan now, the photograph still in his hands, his small body curled inward, taking up as little space as possible. "I don't want you to fight with Grandma and Grandpa," he said quietly. "They get really mad when people fight with them." I heard what he was really saying. I don't want you to get hurt like I do. 9 years old and already protecting everyone but himself. Something shifted inside me, not a crack, a hardening. I'd spent 31 years being the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, the one who sacrificed so others didn't have to be uncomfortable. I'd told myself it was maturity, wisdom, keeping the family together. But what had it cost? My son sitting on his bed, blaming himself for being robbed. My son learning that his voice didn't count. My son believing that taking up space was dangerous. Peace built on my child's silence wasn't peace. It was complicity. "Ethan, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it." He looked up at me. "From now on, things are going to be different. I'm not going to let anyone treat you like you don't matter. Not Grandma, not Grandpa Richard, not Aunt Melissa, not anyone. Do you understand?" "What about keeping the peace?" "There is no peace worth keeping if it means watching you disappear." His eyes filled with tears. Finally, the tears he'd been holding back all day. "Mom?" "Yes, baby?" "Do you think Grandpa William will be okay when you tell him?" I pulled him close and held him while he cried. "I think Grandpa William has been waiting for this. I think he knew, somehow, and I think he has a plan." That night, I waited until Ethan was asleep. I checked on him at 10, found him curled around his pillow, the photograph of him and William tucked under his hand. I covered him gently, took the picture and set it on his nightstand, watched him breathe. Then I went to the kitchen and picked up my phone. It was 11:47, too late to call an elderly man. Any reasonable person would wait until morning, but William had said day or night, and I was done being reasonable. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang once, twice, I almost hung up. Third ring, click. "Amanda?" His voice was alert, not sleepy at all, like he'd been waiting. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something. It's about the piano." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that holds its breath. Then, softly, "They sold it, didn't they?" I froze. "How did you know?" I had a feeling, when they stopped answering my calls about visiting Ethan, when Patricia changed the subject every time I asked about practice. I hoped I was wrong. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I didn't know until today. I would have called sooner. I would have—" "Don't apologize for them." His voice was gentle but firm. "That's not your job anymore." I told him everything. The home theater. The $97,000. Melissa's smirk, the way they'd tried to silence me, and worst of all, Ethan's question in the empty room. Did Grandpa change his mind? When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. I expected anger, grief, maybe tears. What I heard was a soft laugh. Oh, Amanda. Grandpa? Did they really think I wouldn't find out? Did they really think I wouldn't prepare? My heart started beating faster. What do you mean, prepare? Another soft laugh. That piano was never theirs to sell. It's been in a trust since the day Ethan was born, the Clara Collins Memorial Trust. Single asset, single beneficiary. Your parents didn't sell a family heirloom. They sold property that legally belongs to a minor. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers ached. They didn't sell a family asset, William continued. They committed fraud, and I have documentation to prove it. What are you going to do? His voice went calm, cold, certain. I'm going to teach them something I should have taught them 40 years ago, that actions have consequences. Grandpa, I need you to trust me, Amanda. Can you do that? I thought about the empty music room, the photograph under Ethan's hand, the 9 years of small hurts that had led to this moment. Yes. Good. Give me 1 week. Stay away from them. Don't answer their calls. Let me work. And then? And then they'll learn what it costs to steal from family. I closed my eyes. What about Ethan? William's voice softened. Tell him his piano is coming home. Tell him his great-grandfather keeps his promises. And Amanda? Yes? Tell him Clara would have been so proud of him. I hung up and stood in the dark kitchen. 1 week. 1 week of waiting. 1 week of watching my family squirm without knowing why. And then, whatever came next would come. I walked back to Ethan's room and watched him sleep. Your piano is coming home, I whispered. Grandpa promised. In his sleep, Ethan smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him all day. 7 days felt like 7 years. 7 days of waiting, wondering, checking my phone every hour for a message that never came. 7 days of pretending everything was normal while knowing nothing would ever be normal again. William had asked me to trust him. Give me 1 week, he'd said. And I'd agreed, because what choice did I have? Because he was the only person in my family who had ever kept a promise to my son. But trust is easier to give than to hold on to when the silence stretches long. Ethan went to school, did his homework, ate his vegetables, moved through the days like a small ghost, present but not quite there. He didn't touch his keyboard once, not a single note. The silence in our apartment felt like a held breath, like the whole world was waiting for something to break. My phone buzzed constantly, but never with the message I wanted. Patricia called twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. Melissa texted a string of demands and accusations. Richard sent one message, cold and clinical, warning me not to make things worse. I responded to none of them. For the first time in my life, I didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't smooth things over. It felt like freedom. It felt like falling. Thursday night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. My heart jumped. Saturday, 2 p.m. My place. Bring Ethan. A pause, then simply, W. Short. Certain. No room for questions. Whatever was coming, it was coming soon. Saturday arrived gray and cool, the kind of autumn afternoon that couldn't decide between rain and reluctant sunshine. I drove to Willow Creek Senior Living with Ethan in the back seat. Both of us quiet, both of us nervous, both of us hoping for something we couldn't quite name. Is Grandpa okay? Ethan asked as we pulled into the parking lot. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. I think he's more than okay. What does that mean? I think it means he has a plan. Willow Creek was nicer than I'd expected. Not fancy, but comfortable. Well-maintained grounds, friendly staff, the kind of place where people went to live, not just to wait. William had chosen it himself, over Patricia's objections. She'd wanted somewhere more prestigious, more expensive, more impressive to mention at dinner parties. William wanted somewhere peaceful, somewhere he could think. I was beginning to understand why. We walked to his unit, Ethan holding my hand. His palm was sweaty. Mine was too. The door opened before I could knock. William stood there in his usual cardigan and khakis. But something was different. He looked sharper, more alert, like a man who'd been resting for years and finally had a reason to wake up. He hugged Ethan first, long and tight and wordless. Then me. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for trusting me." Inside, his apartment was small but warm, photos of Clara everywhere, her smile watching us from the dresser, the bookshelf, the wall above his reading chair. The smell of peppermint tea filled the air. And on the dining table sat a briefcase. Old leather, brass clasps. I'd never seen it before. "Sit down," William said. "Both of you, I have a lot to tell you." He made tea. Peppermint for us, hot chocolate for Ethan. Moved through his small kitchen with the careful precision of a man who had learned to do everything himself. When we were all settled, cups warming our hands, William reached for the briefcase. "I need to tell you both a story," he said. "About the piano, about Clara, about why your parents made a very serious mistake." Ethan leaned forward. I held my breath. "The piano was a wedding gift," William began. 1952. Clara's grandmother sold everything she had to buy it, jewelry, furniture, even her own instrument. She said Clara deserved something worthy of her talent. He pulled out a photograph, black and white. A young couple standing beside a grand piano. William and Clara on their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful and completely unaware of what the future would hold. Clara played that piano every night for 53 years. Through 4 houses and 2 states and everything life threw at us. When she got sick, when her hands couldn't manage the keys anymore, she made me promise. His voice caught. He took a breath. She made me promise the piano would go to someone who would love it. Not sell it, not store it, not see it as an asset to be liquidated. Someone who would hear it the way I heard her. "Did you know who that would be?" Ethan asked quietly. William smiled. "Not for years. Your father never showed interest. Patricia certainly didn't. She asked me to sell it more than once, said it was wasted space." He looked at Ethan. "Then you were born. And the first time you came to our house, 3 years old and barely able to reach the keys, you walked up to that piano and pressed one note. Just one. And you listened. Waited for it to fade completely before pressing another." Ethan's eyes were wide. Most children bang on the keys, make noise, but you listened. William's voice grew thick. "That's when I knew. Clara would have chosen you." He reached into the briefcase and withdrew a document. Official looking, legal language, stamps and signatures. "This is the Clara Collins Memorial Trust. I established it 7 years ago when Ethan was 2. Single asset, the Bosendorfer Imperial Grand Piano. Single beneficiary, Ethan James Collins." The words landed like stones in still water. "The piano was never a family asset," William continued. "It was never something your parents had any right to touch. It belongs to Ethan, legally, completely, irrevocably." I stared at the document, at the language I could barely understand but somehow felt in my bones. "They sold something that wasn't theirs," I said slowly. "Yes." "They sold property held in trust for a minor." "Yes." "That's not just wrong, that's illegal." William nodded. "Under state law, it's classified as conversion, selling trust property without authorization. In criminal terms, it could be charged as theft or fraud." Ethan spoke up, his voice small but steady. "Does this mean I can get it back?" William reached over and took his great-grandson's hand. "It means the piano was always yours. It still is. And no one, not your grandparents, not anyone, can change that." I felt something shift in my chest. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of justice. "What about the buyer?" I asked. "The collector who paid $97,000? Andrew Chen has been in contact with him. He's a legitimate collector who believed he was making a legitimate purchase. When he learned the truth, he was furious." William smiled thinly. "Not at us. At your parents'. He's cooperating fully with recovery efforts. The piano is coming back? It's already secured. Andrew arranged pickup 3 days ago. It's in climate-controlled storage, waiting. Ethan made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Relief escaping in a rush. But there's something else, William said. Something about the house. I looked up. The house? William reached into the briefcase again. Withdrew another document. Older than the first. Yellowed with age. A property deed. When Clara and I bought that house in 1978, we paid cash. Put it in both our names. When she died, ownership transferred solely to me. He met my eyes. I never gave it to your parents, Amanda. I let them live there. That's not the same thing. The words hung in the air. They've been living in your house, I said slowly, for 40 years, and they think they own it. They assumed. They never asked, just like with the piano. William's expression hardened. They see what they want to see, and they take what they think no one is watching. Why? I asked. Why let them believe it was theirs for so long? Because I know my son, and I knew Patricia the moment I met her. If I'd given them the house, they would have mortgaged it within 5 years, sold it within 10, used it as leverage in ways Clara never would have wanted. He paused. Some things need to be protected from the people who think they own them. Ethan, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. So they're living in your house, and they sold my piano, and they used the money to build a movie theater. William looked at his great-grandson with something like pride. That's exactly right. What are you going to do? William leaned back in his chair. I've had 40 years to watch your father make choices. 40 years to hope he'd become the man Clara believed he could be. 40 years of disappointment. His voice was steady. But stealing from a child to build himself a cinema, that's where it ends. He outlined the plan in simple terms. Step 1, recover the piano. Already done. Step 2, notify Richard and Patricia of the trust violation and their legal liability. Happening Monday. Step 3, address the living situation. They built a $97,000 home theater in my house, William said, using money stolen from my great-grandson, without asking permission, without even considering that they might not have the right. What happens to them? I asked. They have 60 days to find somewhere else to live. The number landed like a verdict. 60 days. The same arbitrary timeline they'd given Ethan when they erased his piano from existence. And if they fight it? William's smile was thin. Andrew has a file that will bury them. Documentation going back 40 years. Every communication, every assumption, every lie. If they want to take this to court, they'll lose. And they'll lose publicly. I thought about my parents, their pride, their carefully constructed image, the way they'd spent decades presenting themselves as successful, generous, respectable people. All of it built on a foundation of borrowed everything. Ethan spoke again. Grandpa, why did they do it? William was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was gentle. Because they've always put some people first and others last. Your mother was always last in their eyes, and because you're her son, they treated you the same way. That's not fair. No, it isn't. But that's the truth. Ethan absorbed this, his small hands clasped in his lap, processing something no 9-year-old should have to process. Then he nodded. Once. Firm. I don't want to be last anymore. William knelt down, his knees protesting, looked Ethan directly in the eye. You were never last to me, or to Clara, and from now on, you won't be last to anyone. He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I'm going to make sure of that. As we prepared to leave, William handed me a folder. Keep this safe, copies of everything. The trust document, the property deed, Andrew's contact information. If anything happens to me, you'll have what you need. Grandpa, you're scaring me. Are you okay? He smiled, warm this time. I'm 72, not fragile. But I've learned to prepare for everything. Your father taught me that, by never being prepared for anything himself. At the door, he gave us final instructions. Next Saturday, there's a party at the house. Melissa's home theater reveal. Very exclusive. I remembered the invitation I'd been ignoring. I wasn't planning to go. William's eyes glinted. Change your plans. Bring Ethan. Wear something comfortable. Why? Because we're going to need witnesses. He paused. And it's going to be a long afternoon. I hesitated at the threshold. Grandpa, what exactly is going to happen at that party? William picked up his teacup, took a slow sip. His expression was calm as a summer morning. Justice, sweetheart, the kind that needs an audience. I looked at Ethan, at the hope in his eyes, at the way he stood a little straighter than he had an hour ago. We'll be there. William nodded, satisfied. One more thing, he said. Tell Ethan the piano is coming home. Tell him his great-grandfather keeps his promises. He looked at my son. And tell him Clara would have been so proud of the musician he's becoming, of the person he already is. We drove home in the fading afternoon light. Ethan was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of a boy who'd learned to be invisible. The silence of a boy who was thinking, planning, hoping. Mom? Yes, baby? Do you think it'll really work, Grandpa's plan? I thought about William, about his patience, his preparation, the 40 years he'd spent watching and waiting and documenting. I think Grandpa has been getting ready for this his whole life, I said. And I think your other grandparents have no idea what's coming. Ethan nodded slowly. Good. He turned to look out the window, watching the world pass by. Mom? Yes? When the piano comes back, can I play the nocturne first, the one Grandpa taught me? My eyes burned. You can play whatever you want, baby. It's your piano. It always was. He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. 6 more days until the party. 6 more days until everything changed. I gripped the steering wheel and drove toward home. Toward whatever came next. The morning after William's call, I woke to unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of anticipation. The kind that hums beneath your skin like a current waiting to spark. Ethan was already awake. I found him at his keyboard, not playing, just touching the keys, running his fingers over them like he was remembering something better. I'm practicing in my head, he said without looking up, for when the real one comes back. My heart cracked and healed in the same breath. That's a good idea. Grandpa said to trust him. So I'm trusting him. 9 years old and already better at faith than I'd ever been. The week stretched ahead of us like a minefield. 6 days until whatever William had planned. 6 days of pretending I didn't know what was coming. He'd been clear on the phone. Act normal. Don't warn them. Surprise is the only advantage we have. I wasn't sure I could fake it. But for Ethan, I would try. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from my mother. Amanda, we need to talk. Call me today. Not a request, a summons. The tone she used when she expected immediate obedience. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed back, busy today, maybe later this week. The read receipt appeared instantly. She was watching, waiting, testing. The game had already begun. Monday morning, my phone rang during my job interview prep. I'd been unemployed for 3 months, ever since the company I worked for downsized. Another thing my family knew and used against me. Another reason Ethan didn't need that expensive piano, according to them. I let the phone ring 4 times before answering. Finally. My mother's voice was sweet on the surface, steel underneath. I've been trying to reach you all weekend. I told you I was busy. Too busy for your own mother? I didn't take the bait. What do you need? I wanted to check on you. You left so abruptly on Saturday. You seemed upset about the renovations. The renovations, that's what she was calling it now. Not the theft. Not the betrayal. The renovations. I was surprised, I said carefully. That's all. Surprised about what? About the piano being gone. Ethan was looking forward to practicing. A pause. I could almost hear her calculating. Amanda, we've been over this. The piano was just sitting there. Ethan can practice at school, or you could rent one. We made a practical decision for the whole family. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I understand, I said. I didn't. Good. Her voice shifted, becoming casual in a way that made my neck prickle. By the way, have you spoken to your grandfather lately? There it was, the real reason for the call. Not really, why? He's been odd. Hasn't returned your father's calls. We're a little worried about him. Worried, right. Worried he might find out what they'd done. I'm sure he's just settling in, I said. He's 72, Mom. Maybe he's tired. Maybe. She didn't sound convinced. Well, if you do talk to him, let us know. We want to make sure he's all right. I promised nothing, she noticed. Amanda, you'll tell us if something's wrong? I'll talk to you later, Mom. I hung up before she could push harder. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from restraint. 31 years of telling my mother what she wanted to hear, and now I had to do it for 6 more days. I could do this. I had to. Tuesday brought Melissa. The texts started around noon, one after another piling up like accusations. Mom says you're being weird. What's your problem? You're not still upset about the piano thing, right? It's a piano, Amanda. Get over it. Jaden is so excited about the theater. You should see his face. I read each one, responded to none. When texting failed, she called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was exactly what I expected. Okay, so you're ignoring me. Very mature. Look, I need you at the reveal party Saturday. Mom wants family photos. Wear something nice for once. And bring Ethan. Jaden wants to show him the surround sound. Call me back. Jaden wants to show Ethan the surround sound bought with Ethan's inheritance. I saved the voicemail. Evidence of tone, if nothing else. That evening, another text arrived. This one from Derek, Melissa's husband. Hey, Amanda. Sorry about all this. For what it's worth, I told them it was a bad idea. I stared at the message. Derek had never texted me directly before. In 15 years of marriage to my sister, he'd barely spoken to me at family gatherings. He existed in Melissa's shadow, agreeing with whatever she said, funding whatever she wanted. Why was he reaching out now? Was he trying to distance himself? Did he sense something coming? I didn't respond to him either, but I filed it away. A crack in the facade, maybe. Or a trap. Wednesday, my father called. This was unusual. Richard never called directly. Patricia usually handled what they called Amanda management. The fact that he was reaching out himself meant they were escalating. Your mother's concerned, he said without greeting. She thinks you're planning something. I almost laughed. Planning what? I don't know, but you've been quiet. That's not like you. Not like me to be quiet. Not like me to stop apologizing. Not like me to refuse the role they'd assigned me. I've just been busy, Dad, job hunting. Right. He didn't believe me. You haven't told your grandfather about the piano, have you? Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because he doesn't need that kind of stress. His heart isn't what it used to be. The doctors... Which doctors? Have you talked to his doctors? A pause. Amanda, don't take that tone with me. I forced my voice flat. I haven't told him anything. Technically true. He already knew. Richard exhaled. Good. Keep it that way. What's done is done. Telling him now only hurts him. I understand. Good. His voice warmed slightly, the reward for compliance. Look, I know you think we favor Melissa, but we're doing what's best for everyone. The theater will be great for family gatherings. You'll use it too. Ethan can watch movies with Jaden. It'll be good for him. Good for him. My son's inheritance turned into movie nights for his cousin. I'm sure it will be wonderful, I managed. See you Saturday. Wear something nice. The same instruction as Melissa. Coordinated messaging. They'd talked about how to handle me. I hung up and stared at the wall. 3 more days. 3 more days of swallowing glass. That night, I called Grandpa William. "They're getting nervous," I told him, "asking if I've talked to you." His chuckle was soft. "Good, let them sweat." "Is everything ready?" "Andrew filed the paperwork today. We're right on schedule." "What paperwork?" A pause. "You'll see Saturday. Trust the process, sweetheart." I did trust him, but the waiting was torture. Thursday after school, Ethan came home quieter than usual. I asked about his day. He shrugged. "Fine." Then he looked at me with those old eyes of his. "Mom, why do you look so tired?" I hadn't realized it showed. "You keep checking your phone," he continued, "and you don't sleep. I hear you walking around at night." I knelt to his level. "I'm just thinking about things." "About Saturday?" "Yes." "About what Grandpa's going to do?" I hesitated. How much should a 9-year-old know about family warfare? "It's okay, Mom." Ethan's voice was steady. "I know something's happening. Grandpa said the piano's coming back, and that things will be different. I don't know what that means exactly, but I trust him." He paused. "Don't you?" I pulled him into a hug. "I do. I really do." We stayed like that for a long moment. Then Ethan pulled back. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "After Saturday, can we not go to Grandma's house anymore? I don't like how I feel there, small, like I'm in the way." My heart shattered for the 100th time that week. "You will never have to feel that way again," I promised. "Never." He nodded, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Jaden told everyone at school his family is rich now. He said his grandparents bought him a movie theater." I felt the anger rise in my chest. "I didn't say anything," Ethan continued, "but that's not true, right?" I looked at my son, his confusion, his quiet dignity, his refusal to fight back even when he'd been robbed. "No, baby, that's not true at all, and soon everyone will know it." Friday morning, the invitation arrived. A printed card in a cream envelope. Formal, official, absurd. "You are cordially invited to the Collins Family Home Theater reveal. Saturday, 2 p.m. refreshments provided. Dress code, smart casual." I read it 3 times. The audacity of formalizing their theft was almost impressive. They were so confident, so certain they'd gotten away with it. They had no idea what was coming. That evening, William called one last time. "Tomorrow's the day," he said. "Are you ready?" "I think so. What should I expect?" "Expect them to be surprised. Expect them to be angry. Expect them to blame you." He paused. "Can you handle that?" I looked across the room. Ethan was at the keyboard, playing scales softly, preparing for a piano that hadn't arrived yet, believing it would. "Yes," I told William. "I can handle anything for him." "That's my girl." Pride in his voice, real pride, the kind I'd been waiting my whole life to hear from my parents. "Andrew will meet us there at 2:15, he continued. "Let them have their moment first. Let them feel proud. Then we'll remind them what pride costs." "Is this really going to work?" His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "Sweetheart, I've been planning this since the day they looked at my great-grandson like he didn't matter. They just didn't know they were being watched." Before he hung up, he added one more thing. "The piano, it's been recovered. Andrew picked it up yesterday. It's in secure storage, waiting." My breath caught. "Where?" "Patience. Ethan will see it soon enough. But first we have a theater to unveil." The irony in his voice was unmistakable. That night, I checked on Ethan at 10. He'd fallen asleep with sheet music on his chest. The Chopin Nocturne, Grandpa's note still in the margin. I covered him gently and took the pages, set them on his nightstand next to the photograph of him and William at the recital. Then I sat alone in the dark living room. Tomorrow would change everything. My relationship with my parents, already fractured, would shatter completely. Melissa would never forgive me. The family I'd known would cease to exist. I thought about what I'd be losing. Sunday dinners I'd never enjoyed. holiday gatherings where Ethan was invisible, phone calls that always left me feeling smaller. Then I thought about what I'd be gaining. A son who knew he was worth fighting for, a grandfather who kept his promises, a future where silence didn't mean surrender. Was it worth it? I thought about the birthday party that never happened, the recital no one attended, the piano sold without a word, the home theater built on my child's stolen future. Yes, it was worth it. Not for revenge, not for satisfaction, for Ethan, for the boy who learned to be small. Tomorrow he would learn something different. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Collins, this is Andrew Chen. Confirmed for tomorrow. See you at 2:15. I typed back, "Thank you, we'll be there." Then I set the phone down and watched the city lights through my window. Tomorrow. 6 days of waiting. And now it was almost here. Saturday morning, I woke at 6. My first thought was, today. My second thought was, no turning back. I showered, dressed, made breakfast. Went through the motions of a normal morning while my pulse hammered in my ears. Ethan appeared in the kitchen already dressed. His good shirt, pants without holes, hair combed with water. "I'm ready," he said. I looked at him. So small, so determined. Me too. We got in the car at 1:30, plenty of time to arrive exactly on schedule. Ethan was quiet as we drove, but not anxious. He trusted his grandfather, he trusted his mother. I merged onto the highway toward my parents' house, toward the party, toward whatever came next. "Mom?" Ethan's voice from the back seat. "Yes? What if Grandma and Grandpa get really mad?" I gripped the steering wheel and thought about every slight, every dismissal, every stolen moment. Then they'll finally know how it feels. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw him smile. Not a happy smile, a ready one. We drove toward the reckoning. Cars lined the street like they were gathering for something important. And to my family, this was important. A celebration of what they'd built, a monument to their success. They had no idea it was also the stage for their downfall. I pulled to the curb and cut the engine. Through the windshield, I counted at least 15 vehicles. My mother had invited half the neighborhood. This wasn't just a family gathering. It was a performance. A chance to show off what the Collins family could afford. "There are a lot of cars," Ethan said quietly. "Grandma likes an audience." The house looked different than last week. Fresh landscaping near the entrance, new potted plants flanking the door. Someone had power washed the driveway. They'd dressed up the exterior like they were staging a home for sale, or hiding something rotten underneath. "Mom?" Ethan hadn't moved to unbuckle. "I don't want to go in." I understood. This was the place where his piano used to live. Now it was a showcase for everything that had been taken from him. "I know, baby, but Grandpa will be here soon. We just have to wait a little longer." He nodded slowly. Then unbuckled his seatbelt with the resignation of someone walking into battle. I checked my phone. 2:03. Andrew Chen would arrive at 2:15, William shortly after. 12 minutes of performance. I could do this. We walked toward the front door. As we got closer, I could hear it. Bass thumping through the walls. They were already showing off the sound system. Ethan squeezed my hand. "I can hear the speakers from here," he said. "Not for long." My mother opened the door before I could knock. She'd been watching from the window. Of course she had. Patricia Collins never missed an entrance. "There you are!" Her smile was wide, her hug stiff, all for show. The neighbors across the street were probably watching. I was starting to worry you wouldn't come. "We wouldn't miss it," I said. The lie tasted like ash. She ushered us inside, and the noise hit me immediately. Chatter, laughter, glasses clinking, the smell of catered food and my mother's perfume, heavy and sweet and suffocating. The house was packed. Relatives I barely recognized mingled with neighbors I'd never spoken to. Aunt Carol stood near the fireplace with Uncle Martin. The Hendersons from next door examined a tray of appetizers. Richard's golf buddies clustered in the corner, bourbon in hand. Everyone dressed smart casual, exactly as instructed. My family was nothing if not coordinated. A banner hung across the archway leading to the back of the house. "Welcome to Collins Cinema," in gold letters on black fabric. They'd named it, like it was an achievement, like it was something to be proud of. "Amanda!" My father's voice cut through the crowd. He crossed the room with his politician's smile, arms open wide. "And Ethan, my favorite grandson!" Ethan flinched. They both knew it wasn't true. Richard put a hand on my shoulder, steering us toward the back of the house. "Come see what we've done. You won't believe it." I already believed it. I'd seen the construction. But I let him lead us anyway, playing the part of the impressed daughter. We passed through the archway, and I caught a glimpse of the wall where Clara's piano used to sit, where Ethan had practiced every Saturday for 2 years, where music used to live. Now it held a massive movie poster in a gilded frame, The Godfather, my father's favorite film, a story about family loyalty and betrayal. The irony was so thick I nearly choked on it. "Here we are," Richard announced, pushing open double doors with theatrical flourish. "Collins Cinema!" The room took my breath away, not in a good way. 4 rows of reclining leather seats in deep burgundy with gold accents. A screen that covered the entire far wall. Speakers mounted in every corner, wires hidden behind custom acoustic panels. A real popcorn machine sat in one corner, the kind you see in actual movie theaters. And the ceiling. Someone had installed fiber optic lights in patterns that mimicked stars. They twinkled softly overhead, turning the room into a private planetarium. This wasn't a home theater. It was a shrine to excess. I did the math in my head. The seats alone were probably $10,000. The projector, another 15. The sound system, the construction, the acoustic treatment, the custom lighting. $97,000, every cent of it stolen from my 9-year-old son. The guests oohed and awed around us. Comments floated through the air like confetti. "Richard, this is incredible." "Patricia, you've really outdone yourself." "Jaden must be thrilled," everyone praised. Everyone marveled. No one asked where the money came from. No one wondered what used to occupy this space. The piano had been erased completely, and no one even noticed. I looked down at Ethan. He stood frozen, staring at the wall. The exact wall where his piano had lived for decades, now covered in acoustic foam and movie memorabilia. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't sad, just hollow. The look of someone confirming something they already knew. This is what I'm worth to them. Nothing. Melissa appeared at my elbow, glass of champagne in hand. "Pretty amazing, right?" She gestured at the room with the pride of someone who'd done the actual work. "Derek designed the whole layout. Well, Derek and the contractor, but it was Derek's vision." She didn't mention the piano, didn't acknowledge Ethan, just basked in the reflected glory of her husband's design skills. Skills funded by a child's stolen inheritance. "It's something," I managed. "Isn't it?" She missed the edge in my voice entirely. "We're going to host movie nights every weekend. Jaden's already planning a Marvel marathon." A Marvel marathon. In a theater built with Ethan's legacy. "That sounds great." Melissa drifted away to accept more compliments. I stayed rooted in place, watching the room fill with admiration for something that should never have existed. "Everyone! Everyone!" Patricia's voice cut through the chatter. She stood at the front of the room, hands raised like a conductor. "Before we start the first movie, Jaden has something special to show you." My nephew bounded to the front of the room. 11 years old, confident, completely at ease in the spotlight. The opposite of Ethan in every way. "Okay, watch this." Jaden held up a wireless remote like a trophy. "I programmed everything myself." He pressed a button. The overhead lights dimmed to a warm amber glow. Another button. The fiber optic stars began to twinkle in patterns. Another. The massive screen lit up with an animated logo. Collins Cinema, in sweeping letters, complete with dramatic music, custom made, professional quality, probably another few $1,000s. The crowd applauded. Comments showered down on Jaden like rose petals. So impressive! What a talented young man. He'll be running Hollywood someday. Patricia beamed. Melissa wiped away a fake tear. Richard clapped his grandson on the shoulder, pride radiating from every pore. 3 generations of favoritism on full display. I looked for Ethan. He'd drifted to the corner of the room, as far from the spotlight as possible. No one greeted him. No one asked about his music. No one acknowledged he existed. He was invisible. Just another body to fill out the family photo later. Jaden spotted his cousin across the room. He walked over with his remote still in hand, the conquering hero approaching the vanquished. Pretty cool, right? Jaden's smile had an edge to it. My grandparents built this just for me. Ethan said nothing. Jaden leaned closer. Bet you wish you had something like this. Still, Ethan said nothing, but I saw his hands clench at his sides, small fists, quiet rage, just like his mother. Jaden! Melissa called from across the room. Come show Mrs. Henderson the surround sound. He bounced away, leaving Ethan alone in his corner. I crossed to my son and put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up. 11 more minutes, I whispered. Can you hold on? He nodded once. That was all. Everyone gather for a family photo. Patricia's voice again, cutting through everything. By the screen! I want everyone in front of the screen! The Collins clan assembled. Richard and Patricia took center position, of course. Melissa and Derek flanked them with Jaden front and center. Golden child, golden position. Amanda and Ethan were directed to the end, almost out of frame. Afterthoughts in our own family. A neighbor volunteered to take the picture. Okay, everyone squeeze together. Patricia pulled Jaden closer to her. Melissa adjusted her hair. Derek straightened his tie. No one moved to include Ethan. He stood at the edge, half hidden behind Derek's shoulder. I made a decision. I stepped forward, pulling Ethan with me, positioned him in front of me, my hands on his shoulders, made sure he was visible. My mother shot me a look. Annoyed, but she couldn't say anything, not with witnesses. Say Collins Cinema. Everyone smiled on command. My smile felt like cracked plaster, but I held it. The flash went off. The moment was captured, evidence of a family that looked whole, but was already broken. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't look, but I knew. 2:14. Andrew Chen was almost here. William, right behind him. The performance was nearly over. I noticed Richard checking his phone, again. He'd been doing it all afternoon, glancing at the screen, then pocketing it quickly. His confident host mask was slipping. Something was bothering him. Maybe he'd felt the shift in the air. Maybe his instincts were warning him of what was coming. Uncle Martin approached Richard with a glass of wine. William's younger brother. I'd always liked him. Say, Richard, where's Bill today? Surprised he's not here for the big reveal. Richard's face twitched, almost imperceptibly. Almost. Dad's not feeling well, sends his regards. Really? Martin frowned. Funny, I talked to him yesterday. Seemed fine to me. Richard changed the subject fast. Too fast. Have you tried the crab cakes? Patricia had them specially made. Martin let it go, but his eyes lingered on Richard for a moment longer. Suspicious. I filed it away. Richard had lied, smoothly, automatically, just like he'd lied about the piano being a family asset, just like he'd lied about everything. But today, the lies wouldn't hold. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the chatter like a knife. Patricia looked up, annoyed. Who's that? Everyone's already here. My heart slammed against my ribs. I checked the time. 2:15 exactly, right on schedule. I'll get it, I said, already moving. Amanda, wait! But I was already at the door, my hand on the knob, my pulse thundering in my ears. I opened it. A man in his 40s stood on the porch, navy suit, conservative tie, leather briefcase. His expression was calm, professional, revealing nothing. "Ms. Collins," his voice was steady. "I'm Andrew Chen." Behind him, a car pulled into the driveway. The door opened, and Grandpa William stepped out. He moved slowly, using his cane, but his posture was straight. He wore his best suit, the charcoal gray one he'd worn to Clara's funeral. I understood the choice. Today was also about honoring what Clara loved, what they'd tried to steal. He walked up the path toward me. Andrew Chen stepped aside to let him pass. William reached me and took my hand, squeezed it once. "You did well, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Now let me do the rest." Ethan appeared behind me. He must have followed when he saw who was at the door. His eyes went wide at the sight of his great-grandfather. He nearly ran into William's arms. William caught him in a one-armed hug, his cane in the other hand. "There's my boy." "Is it time?" Ethan whispered. William nodded. "It's time." The three of them stood together. Andrew Chen with his briefcase full of documents, William in his funeral suit, Ethan with hope in his eyes for the first time in weeks. They turned toward the house. I followed. The party noise continued for about 3 more seconds. Then someone looked toward the entryway. Then someone else. The chatter died. The laughter stopped. The room went still. Patricia stood near the theater doors, champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Her eyes moved from William to Andrew Chen to the briefcase. Something flickered across her face. Fear. "Bill!" Her voice was strained. "What are you doing here? Richard said you weren't feeling well." William smiled. Not a warm smile, not a cold one either. Something in between, something patient. "I'm feeling better than I have in years, Patricia." He walked into the room. Andrew Chen beside him, Ethan and I behind. Richard emerged from the theater, face already pale. "Dad, what's going on?" William looked at his son, looked at the banner, looked at the room full of witnesses. "I thought I'd come see what you built," he said. "It seems quite impressive." "Dad, this isn't... You should have called first." "And miss the celebration?" William shook his head slowly. "No, I wanted to be here, with the whole family, with all these witnesses." He turned to Andrew Chen. "This is my attorney, Andrew Chen. He has some documents I think everyone should see." Patricia's champagne glass trembled in her hand. Richard took a step forward, then stopped. Melissa grabbed Derek's arm. The room was absolutely silent. William looked around one more time. At the theater, at the guests, at the family who thought they'd gotten away with everything. "Shall we begin?" Richard's voice cracked. "Dad, what is this?" William's smile widened. Patient, certain, final. "This is a reckoning, Richard." He gestured toward the leather seats. "Please, everyone, have a seat. We're going to be here a while." Nobody moved. 30 people in the room, and not a single one of them breathed. The fiber optic stars kept twinkling overhead, absurdly cheerful for what was about to happen. William stood in the center of the room like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Andrew Chen beside him, briefcase in hand. The leather seats that had seemed so impressive 5 minutes ago now looked like gallery seating for a trial. Patricia was the first to attempt recovery. She set down her champagne glass with a careful clink and summoned her hostess smile. "Bill, what a wonderful surprise." Her voice was too bright, too loud. The performance of a woman who could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. "We didn't expect you. Richard said you weren't feeling well." William's eyes moved slowly to his son. "Richard says a lot of things." The words landed like stones in still water. I watched the ripples spread across the room, guests exchanging glances, whispers beginning to form. Richard stepped forward, trying to reclaim control. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Dad, this isn't the time. We have guests. Whatever this is, let's discuss it in private." William raised one hand. A small gesture, almost gentle. But Richard stopped mid-stride like he'd hit an invisible wall. "I think this is exactly the right time," William said. You invited all these people to celebrate what you've built. They deserve to know how you paid for it." Uncle Martin, standing near the back with his wife, muttered something I couldn't quite hear, but the tone was clear. "Something's wrong. I told you something was wrong." The whispers grew louder. 30 people realizing they'd walked into something they weren't meant to witness. But none of them moved toward the door. Drama was more compelling than good manners. William surveyed the room. His eyes moved across the leather seats, the massive screen, the fiber optic ceiling. He nodded once, like a doctor confirming a diagnosis he'd already suspected. "Quite a setup," he said. "Must have cost a fortune." Patricia's nervous laugh cut through the tension. "Well, it wasn't cheap, but the children deserve nice things." "Which children?" The question hung in the air. Patricia blinked. "Jaden, of course. It was built for Jaden." "And Ethan? What about Ethan?" William turned and looked at me. Then at Ethan, still holding my hand, still watching everything with those old eyes. "Ethan," William said gently, "would you like to tell everyone what used to be in this room?" The attention of 30 strangers swung toward my son like a spotlight. I felt him tense beside me. Felt him consider retreating into the smallness he'd been taught. Then he straightened his shoulders. "My piano," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "The one from Great-Grandma Clara." The murmurs spread like fire through dry grass. "Piano? What piano? Clara's piano, the antique one?" Aunt Carol's voice rose above the others, sharp with dawning horror. "You had Clara's piano here? The Bosendorfer?" Patricia's mask cracked further. It was an 1893 Imperial Grand," William interrupted. His voice was calm, factual, devastating. "Custom built, one of fewer than 50 in existence, worth considerably more than $97,000. But that's what they sold it for." Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, pressed a hand to her chest. "Sold it? You sold Clara's piano?" The judgment in her voice was immediate, absolute. Patricia's smile finally crumbled completely. "It was a family decision. No." William's single word silenced her. "It wasn't." He nodded to Andrew Chen. The attorney stepped forward, and the click of his briefcase latches was impossibly loud in the quiet room. "My name is Andrew Chen," he said. "I'm Mr. Collins's attorney. I'm here today to address a matter of trust law and property rights." Richard's face went from red to white in the span of 3 seconds. "Dad, what is this?" Andrew withdrew a folder from the briefcase. Thick, official, damning. "This is the Clara Collins Memorial Trust," he said, holding up the first document. "Established in 2017. It names one asset, a Bosendorfer Imperial Grand Piano, serial number 1893-42. He paused, letting the words sink in. "And one beneficiary, Ethan James Collins, minor child." The room went absolutely still. "This piano," Andrew continued, "was never a family asset. It was and remains property held in trust for Ethan. It could not be legally sold, transferred, or disposed of by anyone other than the trustee." He looked directly at Richard and Patricia. "Which was not either of you." Patricia's voice climbed into a register I'd never heard before. "We didn't know about any trust. Bill never told us. Nobody showed us any paperwork." William's expression didn't change. "Ignorance isn't a defense, Patricia, especially when you never bothered to ask." Richard tried a different approach. His voice shifted from defensive to placating. "Dad, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Everyone thought the piano was just sitting there. We made a practical decision for the family." "You made a decision to steal from your grandson." William's voice hardened for the first time. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Melissa pushed forward, Jaden cowering behind her. "This is ridiculous. The piano was just collecting dust. We did something useful with the money." Andrew Chen turned to her with the patience of someone who had heard every excuse. "Ma'am, selling trust property without authorization is a felony. Under state law, it's classified as conversion. In some jurisdictions, it's called theft." Melissa's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. I watched the room transform. The guests who'd been praising the theater 5 minutes ago now looked at it with different eyes. The leather seats, the massive screen, the popcorn machine, the fiber optic stars, all of it purchased with a child's stolen inheritance. The admiration had curdled into something else entirely. Aunt Carol stepped forward, Clara's niece, a woman who had loved her aunt in ways Patricia never had. "You sold Clara's piano?" Her voice trembled with barely contained fury. "The piano she played every night until her hands couldn't anymore? The piano she wanted to stay in the family forever?" Patricia started to answer, but Carol wasn't finished. "You sold it to build a movie theater for an 11-year-old? The disgust in her voice was a physical thing. It filled the room. It landed on Patricia like a weight she couldn't escape. Uncle Martin added his voice to the chorus. That piano survived 2 world wars and a cross-country move. Clara used to say it was the only thing she'd save in a fire. He gestured at the theater around them. "And you sold it, for this." The neighbors exchanged looks. Mrs. Henderson leaned toward Mrs. Parkinson, and I caught the whisper. "I always thought something was off about them." "Remember when they redid the kitchen last year? Same energy. Always spending like they have more than they do." The Collins family reputation was unraveling in real time. 40 years of careful image management destroyed in 5 minutes. Richard's face had gone gray. He noticed the tide turning, noticed the judgment in every pair of eyes. "This is a misunderstanding." His voice was too loud, too desperate. "Dad, please, can we discuss this privately?" William shook his head slowly. "You wanted witnesses for your celebration, Richard. Now you have witnesses for the truth." He turned to Ethan, extended his hand. "Ethan, would you come here, please?" I released my son's hand. He walked to his great-grandfather on steady legs. Small, but not shrinking. Not anymore. William put a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder and addressed the room. "This is my great-grandson. He's 9 years old. He's been playing piano since he was 4. He practiced on Clara's piano every Saturday for 2 years. William's voice caught slightly. "Until 6 weeks ago when it disappeared." He looked down at Ethan. "Did anyone tell you they were selling your piano?" Ethan's voice was clear. "No." "Did anyone ask your permission?" "No." "Did anyone explain what was happening?" "No." Ethan paused. "I just came to practice and it was gone. I thought—" His voice wavered for the first time. "I thought you changed your mind about me. I thought I did something wrong." Someone in the crowd made a sound of sympathy. Aunt Carol pressed both hands to her mouth. Even Mrs. Henderson, who barely knew us, looked stricken. A 9-year-old boy thought his great-grandfather had stopped loving him because his grandparents couldn't be bothered to lie better. Melissa tried once more. "We were going to tell him." "When?" My voice cut through before I could stop it. Every head turned toward me. "When were you going to tell him, Melissa? After Jaden hosted his 10th movie marathon? After Ethan gave up on music entirely?" Melissa's face flushed red. She grabbed Jaden's arm and pulled him back, but there was nowhere to hide. Andrew Chen stepped forward again, drawing attention back to the legal matter at hand. "To summarize the situation," he said, his tone as calm as a news anchor reporting a hurricane. "Richard and Patricia Collins sold property held in trust for a minor. They did so without legal authority and without disclosure. The proceeds, $97,000, were used for personal renovation of a property they do not own." Wait. I felt the words land differently than everyone else. "Do not own." Richard's head snapped up. Patricia went very still. Andrew continued as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb. "The purchaser of the piano has been notified that he acquired stolen property. He's cooperating with recovery efforts. The instrument has been located and secured. Ethan's head snapped up. My heart leaped. It will be returned to its rightful owner within the week. Ethan's breath caught. Not a sob, just relief, escaping in a rush. Richard found his voice. You can't do this. That money is gone. It's in the walls. We can't just give it back. He gestured wildly at the theater around them, as if the leather seats might support his case. Andrew remained unmoved. That's between you and the buyer, Mr. Collins. He's already retained his own attorney. I suspect you'll be hearing from them soon. Patricia sank onto one of the leather seats, the seats paid for with Ethan's inheritance. Her face had gone the color of ash. Bill, please. Her voice was barely a whisper. We're family. You can't do this to family. William looked at her for a long moment. I couldn't read his expression. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was something older, something that had been waiting decades to be released. You did this to family, Patricia. I'm simply making it visible. Derek, who had been silent through all of this, took a step away from his wife, a physical distance that spoke louder than any words. He caught my eye and shook his head slightly. I told them, his expression said. For what it's worth, I told them this was a bad idea. I remembered his text message from earlier in the week. He'd seen this coming, and now he was already choosing sides. Patricia looked around the room, at the neighbors backing toward the door, at the relatives who wouldn't meet her eyes, at her own husband, frozen in place, useless as always. Haven't you made your point? Her voice cracked. Can we stop this now, please? Richard rallied one last time. Yes, Dad. Message received. We made a mistake. We'll fix it. Now, can we please ask everyone to leave so we can discuss this as a family? His voice broke on the word family, like he'd just remembered what it was supposed to mean. William was quiet for a moment. He looked at his son, at his daughter-in-law, at the theater they'd built on a foundation of theft. Then he spoke. There's one more thing we need to discuss, before anyone leaves. The guests who had been edging toward the door stopped moving. Even I felt my breath catch, though I knew what was coming. The piano wasn't the only thing you assumed was yours. William's eyes swept the room, the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath their feet. We should talk about this house. Richard's face went from gray to white to something that looked almost green. What about the house? William smiled, thin, patient, terrible. The house you've been living in for 40 years, the house you renovated without permission. The house that has never... He paused, letting the word hang, not once, in 4 decades belonged to you. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia stood slowly, unsteady on her feet. What are you talking about? This is our house. We raised our children here. You gave it to us when we got married. William shook his head. I let you live here. That's not the same as giving it to you. Did you ever see a deed with your name on it, Patricia? Silence. Did you, Richard? In 40 years, did either of you ever actually look at the property records? More silence. Andrew Chen reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second document, older than the first, yellowed with age. This is the original deed for this property, purchased in 1978 by William and Clara Collins. Upon Clara's death, full ownership transferred to William. He looked up. It has never been transferred since. Richard's voice came out as a whisper. Dad, what are you saying? William looked around the room one final time, at the theater built with stolen money, at the guests who were already composing the stories they'd tell tomorrow, at the family that had taken everything and never once said thank you. I'm saying you built a movie theater in my house, with money stolen from my great-grandson. He turned to Andrew. Show them the eviction notice. Andrew Chen reached into the briefcase one final time. The room held its breath. Even the fiber optic stars seemed to stop twinkling, as if the universe itself was waiting to see what came next. He withdrew a single sheet of paper. Official letterhead, legal language, a date stamp in the corner. He held it the way a surgeon holds a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, about to cut deep. Richard took a step forward, hands raised like he could physically stop what was happening. Wait, just wait. Whatever that is, we can discuss it. In private. Dad, please, send everyone home first. His voice cracked on the word home. The irony hung in the air like smoke. William shook his head slowly. No, Richard. You made this a public celebration. You invited these people to admire what you built. They should know the foundation it stands on. He nodded to Andrew. Proceed. Andrew's voice was steady, professional, completely devoid of emotion. This is a formal notice to vacate, addressed to Richard Collins, Patricia Collins, Melissa Collins Warren, and Derek Warren. You have 60 days to vacate the property at this address. The property belongs to William Henry Collins. You are not and have never been legal owners or tenants with protected rights. Patricia made a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something between the two, the sound of a world collapsing inward. 60 days? Her voice climbed into a register I'd never heard before. You're giving us 60 days? William didn't flinch. I'm giving you more than you deserve. Patricia stood, unsteady, swaying slightly like the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor spreading across her skin. Bill, you can't do this. The words tumbled out desperate and broken. This is my home. I raised my children here. I decorated every room. I planted the garden. I hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and— You lived here, William interrupted. His voice was flat, final. At my pleasure. That pleasure has ended. You're lying. Patricia spun toward the guests, desperate for allies who were no longer willing to be found. He's lying. He gave us this house. 40 years ago, when we got married, he gave it to us. William's expression didn't change. I never gave you anything. I let you stay. There's a difference. He paused. Show me a deed with your name on it, Patricia. Show me a single document proving ownership. She couldn't. There wasn't one. Aunt Carol spoke from somewhere behind me. Clara's niece. Her voice was cold with dawning understanding. I always wondered how they afforded this place. Richard was 23 when they moved in. No real job, no savings. She shook her head slowly. I asked Clara once. She changed the subject. Now I understand why. The family mythology was crumbling in real time, 40 years of Richard and Patricia acting like owners. Renovations, parties, holidays, all in a house that had never belonged to them. The kitchen they'd redone last year, the new roof 5 years ago, the theater they'd just built, all improvements to someone else's property, without permission, without acknowledgement, without a single word of gratitude. Patricia's desperation peaked. We have rights. We've lived here for 40 years. Squatters' rights, adverse possession, something. Andrew Chen responded with the patience of someone who had anticipated every argument. Those doctrines don't apply to permissive occupancy, Mrs. Collins. Mr. William Collins has documentation of verbal agreements, utility arrangements, and maintenance communications spanning 4 decades. You were guests who overstayed their welcome, nothing more. Richard grabbed his father's arm. Not gently. Dad, think about what you're doing. You're destroying this family. William looked at the hand gripping his sleeve, then at his son's face. The desperation there, the fear, the complete absence of remorse. You destroyed it, Richard. When you sold a child's piano to build yourself a cinema. He pulled his arm free. I'm simply making the destruction visible. Richard tried a different approach. He released William's arm and changed his posture, suddenly smaller, softer. The wounded son rather than the angry patriarch. Dad, I'm sorry. We made a mistake. We should have asked about the piano. We should have talked to you first. The apology that should have come weeks ago. We can work this out. We're family. Family forgives. William studied his son for a long moment. You're sorry you got caught, Richard. You're sorry there are witnesses. But you're not sorry you did it. That's not true. If I hadn't found out, you'd be watching a movie right now, eating popcorn with your grandson, while my great-grandson practiced on a rented keyboard in a 2-bedroom apartment. William's voice hardened. Don't insult me by pretending this is about family. Uncle Martin stepped forward, William's younger brother, a man who had known Richard since birth. Richard, I've watched you your whole life. I never thought you'd turn out like this. Richard's face twisted. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Martin cut him off. You took the easy road every chance you got, and when easy wasn't enough, you took from a child. Richard's mask finally cracked. The pleading son vanished, replaced by something uglier, something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. This is insane. It's just a piano. Ethan's a kid. He doesn't need a $97,000 instrument. He's not going to be a concert pianist. He's just... He stopped himself, but not fast enough. He's just what? I heard myself ask. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Richard couldn't finish, because finishing meant saying what he really thought, that Ethan didn't matter, that Ethan had never mattered, that some children were worth $97,000 and some weren't. Ethan stepped forward, still holding my hand, but standing taller than I'd ever seen him. I don't need to be a concert pianist, he said. His voice was quiet but steady. I just wanted to play. Great-Grandma Clara's piano sounded like home. He looked directly at his grandfather. Now it sounds like nothing, because you took it. 9 years old, speaking truth to power. Richard had no response. Melissa pushed forward, dragging Jaden with her. This isn't fair. We didn't make this decision alone. Mom and Dad said it was fine. They said Grandpa wouldn't care. The classic Melissa move. Find someone else to take the fall. I told Derek it seemed wrong, but Richard said it was handled. Patricia said Grandpa was too old to notice. She was building her defense in real time, positioning herself as a victim. We trusted them. Derek spoke for the first time. His voice was tired, done. Melissa, stop. What? You knew exactly what you were doing. He stepped away from his wife. Physical distance that spoke volumes. You picked out the speakers yourself. You chose the popcorn machine. You spent 3 hours debating the color of the seats. Derek! Melissa's voice was sharp with betrayal. You're supposed to support me. I did support you, for 15 years. He looked at her like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. But I won't support this. He turned to William. I'm sorry, sir. I should have stopped it. I told them it was wrong, but I didn't fight hard enough. He shook his head. That's on me. William nodded once, acknowledging without forgiving. Jaden, 11 years old and finally understanding that something terrible was happening, looked between his parents. Mom, did we steal Ethan's piano? Melissa's face went red. It's complicated. It's not complicated. Ethan's voice again. Quiet, certain. You did. Jaden stared at his cousin. 2 boys on opposite sides of a family chasm. One who'd been given everything. One who'd had everything taken. The guests began moving toward the door, the awkward shuffle of people who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. No one wanted to stay for the rest of this. But no one wanted to miss what happened next either. The Henderson family left first, faces carefully neutral. Then the Parkinsons. Then Richard's golf buddies, slipping out without goodbyes. Aunt Carol stopped in front of William. She took his weathered hand in both of hers. Clara would be proud of you, she said softly. She always worried about what would happen to her things. Now I know you kept your promise. She kissed his cheek and walked out. Uncle Martin paused by Richard. You were my favorite nephew once. I don't know who you are now. Richard said nothing. Martin left without looking back. Within 5 minutes, the room had emptied. Only family remained, the real family. William, me, Ethan, and the others. Richard, Patricia, Melissa, Derek, Jaden. 2 sides of the same blood. A generation of wrong facing a reckoning. The front door clicked shut on the last guest. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. 30 witnesses to the Collins family's disgrace. By Monday, the whole neighborhood would know. By Friday, the whole town. Richard's reputation. Patricia's standing. Melissa's social circle. All of it. Gone with the closing of a door. William moved to the front of the theater. Standing where the massive screen still displayed the Collins Cinema logo. The logo that had cost thousands to design. The logo nobody would ever see again. "Now that we can speak privately," he said, "let me be clear about what happens next." Patricia made a small sound. Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "The piano will be returned to Ethan within the week. Andrew has arranged secure storage until transport can be coordinated. It will not come back to this house." William looked at me. "It will go wherever Amanda and Ethan go." Ethan squeezed my hand. "The collector who purchased the piano wants his money back. $97,000. That is your debt, Richard. Yours and Patricia's. I suggest you find a way to pay it." Patricia's voice was barely audible. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then you'd better get creative." Richard tried again. "Dad, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. Reason says you stole from a child. Reason says you owe restitution." William's voice could have cut glass. "Reason says actions have consequences." He paused. "Which brings us to the house." Patricia made another small sound, like an animal caught in a trap. "You have 60 days to find alternative housing. I will not extend that deadline." William gestured at the theater around them. "Every improvement you've made to this property belongs to me now, including this." Richard's voice was hoarse. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life." "But where will we go?" "That's not my concern anymore." Melissa stepped forward, mascara running down her cheeks. "What about us? Derek and I live here too." "Then I suggest you start looking for an apartment." William's gaze moved to Derek. "Unless you've already made other arrangements." Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. "There is one condition," William continued. "If you leave peacefully, without contest, I won't pursue criminal charges for the piano." Hope flickered across Patricia's face. "But if you fight this, if you drag this into court, if you try to claim rights you don't have..." William nodded toward Andrew. "My attorney has a file that will bury you. Documentation, correspondence, bank records, everything needed to prove you knowingly sold trust property." Andrew patted his briefcase. "It's quite comprehensive." The fight went out of Richard all at once. His shoulders slumped. His face aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Patricia looked around the room. At the theater she'd been so proud of. At the house she'd treated as her own. At the life that was crumbling around her like ash. "Bill." Her voice was barely a whisper. "What about us? What happens to us?" William was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, but no less final. "You have 60 days. I suggest you use them wisely." Ethan tugged my hand. I looked down at him. "Mom?" His voice was small but steady. "Can I ask Grandpa something?" I nodded. Ethan walked to his great-grandfather, past his grandparents who wouldn't meet his eyes, past his aunt who was crying into her hands, past his cousin who looked lost and scared, to the man who had kept his promises. "Grandpa?" "Yes, Ethan?" "When the piano comes back..." He paused. "Will you teach me more songs, like you used to, like Great-Grandma Clara taught you?" William's composure cracked for the first time. His eyes glistened. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. "I will teach you every song I know, and then we'll learn new ones together." He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Clara would have wanted that. She loved music, and she would have loved you. Ethan hugged him, fierce, tight, a child finally feeling safe. William closed his eyes and held on. Richard watched them. His father, his great-grandson, the relationship he'd tried to destroy, the love he'd sold for $97,000. Too late to matter, but not too late to witness. William released Ethan and stood slowly. He took my son's hand in his. "Amanda, let's go. We don't need to stay here anymore." I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Where are we going?" "My place, for now." He looked around the room one final time. "We have arrangements to discuss, about the future." We walked toward the door, past Richard, frozen in place, past Patricia, collapsed in a leather seat, past Melissa, mascara ruined, still trying to quiet Jaden's questions, past Derek, standing apart, already a stranger to his own family. At the threshold, I paused, turned back one last time. My mother looked up at me. Her eyes were red, pleading. "Amanda, please," her voice broke. "Talk to him. You're the only one he listens to. Please." I considered her face. The woman who had canceled Ethan's birthday for Jaden's soccer game, who had called my son not normal, who had sold his inheritance and built a cinema she would never have invited him to use. "No, Mom," I said quietly. "I'm done translating your failures into his forgiveness." I took Ethan's other hand. "Enjoy your 60 days." We walked out together, William, Ethan, and me. 3 generations leaving a house that had never been a home. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. The air smelled like cut grass and freedom. Behind us, I heard Patricia start to sob. I didn't look back. The morning after the reckoning, I woke to unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of my apartment, with its traffic noise and neighbors' television bleeding through thin walls. This was different, deeper. The silence of a place designed for rest. William had insisted we stay the night at his apartment in the senior community. "You're not going back to that apartment alone," he'd said. "Not tonight." I'd been too drained to argue. Ethan had fallen asleep in the car, and William had carried him to the guest room like he weighed nothing at all. I lay in bed staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Photos of Clara lined the dresser. A quilt I remembered from childhood visits covered my legs. The smell of peppermint tea drifted from somewhere deeper in the apartment. William was already awake. I found him in the small kitchen, standing at the stove, making pancakes. He moved slowly but deliberately, the way he did everything now. Age had stolen his speed, but not his precision. "Ethan's still sleeping," he said without turning around. "Let him rest. Yesterday was a lot for a 9-year-old. I sat at the small table. "Yesterday was a lot for a 31-year-old too." He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him since this began. "Pancakes help," he said. "Clara always said so." We ate in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The kind that exists between people who understand each other. When I finally checked my phone, I found 17 missed calls, 42 text messages, all from the same 3 numbers. Mom, Dad, Melissa. I didn't read a single one. I turned the phone face down and reached for more coffee. William noticed. "They're not going to stop." "I know. What are you going to do?" I took a long breath, thought about 31 years of answering every call, responding to every summons, making myself available for every demand. "Nothing," I said. "For the first time in my life, absolutely nothing." William nodded approvingly. "That's my girl." Monday morning, I was back at my apartment with Ethan. The small space felt different now, not cramped, safe, a refuge that my parents couldn't reach. My phone rang around 10, Andrew Chen's number. "Ms. Collins, I wanted to update you on some developments." His voice was professionally neutral, but I could hear something beneath it. Satisfaction, maybe. "The collector who purchased the piano has been in contact. His name is Harold Whitmore. He's quite upset." "At us?" "At your parents. He paid $97,000 for what he believed was a legitimate sale. Learning that he purchased stolen property did not sit well with him. I could imagine. He's retained his own attorney. He's demanding full repayment within 30 days. 30 days? I did the math in my head. They don't have that kind of money. No, Andrew agreed. They don't. What happens if they can't pay? Liens against any assets they do own, garnished wages, potentially a civil judgment that follows them for years. Andrew paused. Mr. Whitmore isn't interested in payment plans. He wants his money back, or he wants consequences. I processed this. My parents, who had lived their entire lives as if money would always appear when they needed it, were about to learn what happened when it didn't. What about the piano? Andrew's tone warmed slightly. That's the good news. Mr. Whitmore has agreed to release it back to the trust. He understands Ethan is an innocent party in all this. We're arranging transport now. My heart lifted. When? End of the week. I'll need a delivery address. I'll let you know. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my kitchen. My parents owed $97,000 they didn't have. For a piano they didn't own. To build a theater in a house they couldn't keep. The math of their greed was finally catching up. I felt nothing but grim satisfaction. Tuesday, Patricia's campaign began in earnest. The texts started around noon. A new approach. No longer demanding, now pleading. Amanda, please call me. We need to talk about this as a family. Your father isn't sleeping. His blood pressure is dangerous. You're going to give him a heart attack. I read each message. The manipulation was so familiar I could have written the script myself. Step 1. Appeal to guilt. Your father's health. Step 2. Invoke family. We need to talk as a family. Step 3. Make the victim responsible. You're going to give him a heart attack. 31 years of this. The same playbook, recycled endlessly. I listened to one voicemail. Just one. Patricia's voice was thick with tears, trembling with manufactured despair. How can you do this to us? We're your parents. Everything we did was for the family, for the children. You're tearing us apart over a piano. Over a piano, Amanda. I deleted it before she finished. That evening, Ethan noticed me staring at my phone. Mom, why do you keep looking at it like that? I set it down. Grandma's trying to talk to me. Are you going to answer? No. He thought about this for a moment, then nodded. Good. 9 years old and already wiser than I'd been at 30. I typed one message, the only one I would send. Do not contact me again. If you have legal matters to discuss, contact Andrew Chen. Then I blocked her number, and Richard's, and Melissa's. The silence that followed felt like breathing for the first time. That night, a knock at the door. My heart jumped. I looked through the peephole, already preparing for Patricia's face, but it wasn't her. Derek stood in the hallway. Alone, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, and his wedding ring, I noticed, was conspicuously absent from his finger. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, he said, but I need to talk to you. I hesitated, then opened the door. He sat on my second-hand couch like it might break beneath him. I want you to know I tried to stop them. His voice was tired, hollow. Not hard enough, obviously, but I tried. I know, you texted me. When they first talked about selling the piano, I said it was a terrible idea. Melissa laughed, said I was being dramatic. Richard told me it was none of my business. Patricia said I didn't understand how family worked. He shook his head. Maybe I don't. Why are you here, Derek? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm leaving her. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen him pull away during the confrontation. Seen the distance grow in real time. When? I told her last night. She's staying at your parents' place. A bitter laugh. Fitting, I guess. All of them together in a house they're about to lose. I'm sorry. Don't be. I should have done this years ago. He looked at me directly for the first time. I should have done more for Ethan too. Every time they overlooked him, I noticed. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to rock the boat. His voice cracked. I was a coward. You're apologizing now, that's something. It's not enough. No, I agreed. But it's a start. He stood to leave, then paused. You should know. They're panicking. Your father called 3 banks yesterday trying to get a loan. All rejected. Your mother's been on the phone with every relative she knows trying to borrow money. He shook his head. No one's returning her calls. Word got out about what happened. The whole town knows. Good. He nodded, unsurprised by my response. One more thing. Jaden asked about Ethan. I stiffened. He wanted to know if Ethan hates him. I thought about my son, the boy who'd been overlooked, dismissed, stolen from, the boy who had every right to hate his cousin. Ethan doesn't hate anyone, I said. He's too good for that. I know. That's why I wanted you to know. Derek moved toward the door. Maybe someday, when this is all over, the boys could... Maybe, I said. But not yet. He left without another word. Wednesday, I needed groceries. A simple errand. Milk and bread. Should have been invisible. But in a small town, nothing stays invisible for long. Mrs. Henderson found me in the dairy aisle. The neighbor from the party, the one who'd witnessed everything. Amanda, she approached with purpose. I've been thinking about you. Here it comes, I thought. The judgment, the gossip, the inevitable whispered condemnation. But she surprised me. I just want you to know, what your parents did was awful. Everyone's talking about it, but not the way you might think. She leaned closer. People are on your side, on Ethan's side. Nobody can believe they sold that child's piano. I didn't know what to say. Thank you. Your grandfather is a good man. Clara was my friend, you know. We had coffee every Tuesday for 15 years. Her eyes softened. She'd be proud of what William did. She always worried about that piano ending up in the wrong hands. I remember Clara being very particular about things. Mrs. Henderson smiled. She was, and she had good reason. She glanced around, then leaned even closer. Between us, your mother called me yesterday. Wanted me to talk sense into Bill. Can you imagine? What did you say? I told her I had nothing to say. She hung up on me. Mrs. Henderson shrugged. Some people never learn. I'm sorry you got stuck with those as parents. I finished my shopping in a daze. Strangers nodded at me in the aisles. Small acknowledgments, silent support. One woman I didn't recognize squeezed my arm as she passed. Good for you, she whispered. Good for your boy. The town had chosen sides, and for once, I was on the winning one. Thursday, Andrew Chen called with news I hadn't expected. Your father was hospitalized yesterday. My stomach dropped, despite everything. What happened? Elevated blood pressure, chest pains. They're running tests. Andrew's voice was carefully neutral. It's not a heart attack, but it's not nothing. What caused it? Apparently, he received the demand letter from Mr. Whitmore's attorney. Full repayment in 30 days or litigation. A pause. He collapsed while reading it. I closed my eyes, searched for the guilt I was supposed to feel, found only emptiness. Is he going to be okay? Physically, the doctors are optimistic, but the stress isn't going anywhere. I thought about my father, the man who'd sold my son's inheritance without a second thought, who'd built a cinema while Ethan cried in an empty room, who'd told me I was being dramatic for caring about a child's broken heart. Now his own heart was paying the price. Karma, maybe, or just cause and effect. Should I visit him? Andrew was quiet for a moment. That's not a legal question, Ms. Collins. I know, I'm asking as a human being. Then I'd say do what gives you peace, nothing more. I already knew the answer. There would be no visit, no bedside reconciliation, no deathbed forgiveness. Some bridges, once burned, stay burned. That evening, Patricia called from a new number. I answered before I realized my mistake. Your father is in the hospital and you won't even visit? Her voice was sharp with accusation. What kind of daughter are you? I let the words wash over me, felt them try to find purchase, felt them slide away. The kind you raised, I said. I hung up and blocked the new number too. Friday morning, the truck arrived. I'd taken the day off from job hunting. Some things were more important than resumes. At 10 a.m. exactly, a white delivery vehicle pulled into the apartment complex. 2 men in professional uniforms climbed out, followed by a third figure I recognized. Andrew Chen, briefcase in hand, smiled when he saw me. Ethan had been awake since 6, unable to sleep. He'd stationed himself by the window watching for the truck. When it appeared, he didn't move, just stared, like he was afraid to believe it. The men worked carefully, professionally. A Bosendorfer Imperial Grand wasn't something you rushed. They used specialized equipment, padded blankets, precise movements. I watched my son's inheritance emerge from the truck, black lacquer gleaming in the morning sun. 131 years old and still beautiful. It barely fit in our apartment. The living room had to be completely rearranged. The second-hand couch shoved against a wall. The TV moved to a corner. Furniture I'd owned for years suddenly seemed like obstacles to be cleared, but when the piano finally settled into place, it looked like it had always belonged there, like the room had been waiting for it, like our whole apartment had been built around an empty space that was finally filled. Ethan approached slowly. He reached out and touched the fallboard, lifted it carefully to reveal the keys. 88 of them. Ivory and ebony. Perfect. Hi, he whispered to the piano. I missed you. My eyes burned. I didn't try to stop the tears. Andrew handed me an envelope. The trust documents, updated and fully executed. Ethan is the sole beneficiary until age 21. After that, it's his outright. He met my eyes. No one can touch it again. I clutched the envelope like a shield. Thank you, for everything. Andrew smiled. Thank your grandfather. He planned this for years. I just handled the paperwork. He left us alone, just Amanda and Ethan and the piano, the weight of everything that had happened, and the lightness of what was finally right. Ethan sat at the bench, adjusted the height, placed his hands on the keys. Mom, can I play Great-Grandma Clara's song? The one Grandpa taught me? Of course, baby. He took a breath and began to play. The Chopin Nocturne filled our small apartment. Notes I'd heard 100 times before, but never like this, never in my own home, never with my son safe, never with justice done. As the music swelled, my phone lit up on the counter. A text from William. I heard the piano arrived. There's something else we need to discuss. The house, your future, Ethan's future. Come see me this weekend. Bring the boy. It's time to talk about what happens next. I looked at my son, lost in music, finally at peace. Whatever came next, we were ready. Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of piano, not a recording, not a memory, real music, filling our small apartment like sunlight through curtains. Ethan was already dressed, sitting at the Bosendorfer, playing scales with a concentration I hadn't seen in weeks. His small hands moved across the keys with growing confidence, and Clara's piano responded to every touch like it had been waiting for him. I lay in bed for a moment, just listening. This was real. This was ours. This was home. When I finally emerged, Ethan looked up with a smile that reached his eyes. I've been practicing, he said, for when Grandpa comes. William was arriving at noon. He'd called last night to confirm, said he was bringing something important, something he wanted us both to see. I cleaned the apartment even though it was already clean. Rearranged the couch cushions 3 times. Ethan watched me with amusement. Mom, why do you keep moving stuff? I want everything to be nice for Grandpa. He doesn't care about cushions. Ethan turned back to the keys. He cares about us. 9 years old, and still the wisest person I knew. At noon exactly, there was a knock at the door. William was never late. It was one of his many Clara-isms, as he called them. She'd believed punctuality was a form of respect. I opened the door to find him holding a cardboard box, not large but clearly precious. He cradled it against his chest like it contained something fragile. "I brought something," he said. "May I come in?" Ethan was already at the door. "Grandpa?" The hug was long and tight and necessary. William held my son with one arm, the box secure in the other, and I watched 2 generations of my family embrace like they were the only people in the world. When they finally separated, William walked toward the piano. He set the box on a side table and ran his hand along the lacquered surface of the Bösendorfer. "Hello, old friend," he murmured. "It's been a while since I've seen you somewhere safe." He turned to me. "Thank you for giving it a home." "It was always Ethan's. We just didn't know how to fight for it." "You learned." His eyes were warm. "That's what matters." I noticed the box again. Old, worn at the corners. A name written on the side in faded marker. Clara's things. Whatever was in that box was part of today's conversation. I could wait. I'd learned patience. Ethan tugged at William's sleeve. "Grandpa, will you listen? I've been practicing. In my head mostly, while the piano was gone. But now I can really play." William settled into the second-hand armchair I'd positioned near the piano. It looked shabby next to the magnificent instrument, but he didn't seem to notice. "I've been waiting to hear this for weeks," he said. Ethan sat at the bench, adjusted his posture the way William had taught him, took a breath, and began to play. The Chopin Nocturne, the same piece, the one Clara taught William 60 years ago, the one William taught Ethan 2 years ago. 3 generations connected by these notes, these rhythms, this music that had survived everything. Ethan's small hands moved with surprising confidence. Not perfect, but real, present, alive. I watched his face transform as he played, concentration giving way to something deeper. Joy, maybe. Peace. The Bösendorfer had a voice I'd forgotten, rich, deep, resonant. In our small apartment, it seemed almost too much, too beautiful for such a humble space. But then it settled into the walls, the furniture, the air itself, like it was teaching our home how to hold it. When the last note faded, silence filled the room. The good kind, the kind that means something is complete. William's eyes were wet. "Clara would be so proud of you," he said. Ethan's voice was small. "You really think so?" "I know so. She's probably up there right now bragging to everyone who'll listen." Ethan laughed, bright, unguarded, healed. I pressed a hand to my chest. This was what I'd been fighting for, this exact moment. William wiped his eyes and reached for the cardboard box. "I brought this because I want you both to understand something. About Clara, about the piano, about what family is supposed to mean." He opened the flaps carefully, revealing contents I couldn't quite see from where I stood. "These are things I've never shown anyone, not even your grandmother, Amanda, not even Richard." He looked at me, then at Ethan. "It's time you knew the whole story." He reached into the box and withdrew a black and white photograph. A young woman at a piano. Not the Bösendorfer, something simpler, but her posture, her focus, her obvious love for the instrument, those were unmistakable. "This was Clara in 1950, William said. "She was 17. Her family didn't have money for lessons, so she taught herself. By the time I met her, she played better than anyone I'd ever heard." He handed the photo to Ethan, who studied it with reverence. "I fell in love with her while she played," William continued. "I was too nervous to talk to her at parties. But when she sat at a piano, I could listen for hours. She noticed eventually. Said I was the only one who really heard her." Another photograph emerged from the box. William and Clara on their wedding day, standing beside the Bösendorfer, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what their family would become. Her parents couldn't afford a dowry, so her grandmother sold everything she had, jewelry, furniture, even her own piano. William's voice grew thick. "And she bought this, an 1893 Imperial Grand. Said Clara deserved an instrument worthy of her gift." Ethan traced the edge of the photograph with his finger. "It's the same piano." "The same one you're sitting at right now." William smiled. 131 years old. Survived 2 world wars and a cross-country move. Survived your grandparents, too. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "When Clara's grandmother died, Clara made me promise. The piano would only go to someone who would love it, really love it, not keep it as decoration, not sell it for profit. Someone who would hear it the way I heard Clara." "Did you know who that would be?" Ethan asked. "Not for years. I watched. I waited. Your father never showed interest." William glanced at me. "Patricia wanted us to sell it early on, said it was wasted space." Of course she had. "Then Ethan was born," William continued, "and then this one came along." He ruffled Ethan's hair. 3 years old, first time at our house. Clara had passed by then, but the piano was still there. "I remember," Ethan said quietly. "Sort of. You walked right up to it, pressed one key, and listened." William's eyes grew distant. "Most children bang on the keys, make noise, but you listened, waited for the note to fade completely before pressing another." He looked at my son with something like wonder. "That's when I knew. Clara would have chosen you too." Ethan looked up from the wedding photograph. "Grandpa, was great-grandma Clara like me?" William tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "Was she quiet? Did people not notice her?" William's expression shifted. Something between sadness and recognition. "Yes, Ethan. She was exactly like you, quiet, overlooked. People underestimated her because she didn't make noise." He reached over and squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "And just like you, she deserved to be heard." He reached into the box again and withdrew a bundle of envelopes tied with ribbon. Old paper, faded ink, Clara's handwriting on each one. "She wrote me letters, even after we were married. She said some things were easier to write than say." He selected one envelope carefully. "I'd like to read one to you, if that's okay." Ethan and I both nodded. William unfolded the letter, yellowed with age, fragile as memory. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest William, some days I worry that the piano will outlive everyone who understands it, that someday it will end up in the home of people who see only its price, not its soul. But then I watch you listen when I play, and I remember. There will always be someone who hears. Our job is to make sure the piano finds them. Promise me you'll protect it. Promise me you'll wait. The right person will come. You'll know them when you see them. Love always, Clara." Silence filled the room. Ethan stared at the letter like it was holy. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. William folded the paper carefully and returned it to its envelope. "She wrote that in 1992, he said. 15 years before you were born, Ethan. And she was right. I knew you the moment I saw you listen." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "I promise I'll take care of it forever. I'll never let anyone take it again." William smiled, warm, real, at peace. "I know you will, son. I know you will." He placed the letters back in the box, but his hand lingered inside. There was more. He withdrew a small velvet pouch, dark blue, worn smooth by years of handling. "There's one more thing, something I've been saving for when the time was right." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. A small photograph and a key. Not a modern key. Antique. Brass. Ornate. "Do you know what this is?" he asked Ethan. Ethan leaned forward. "Is it for the piano?" "Smart boy. This is the original key to the Bosendorfer. It locks the fall board, protects the keys from dust and damage." William turned the key in his fingers. "Clara's grandmother gave it to her on her wedding day. Clara gave it to me when she died." He placed the key in Ethan's palm. "And now I'm giving it to you." Ethan held it like it might shatter. But what if I lose it? You won't, William's voice was firm. You know its value now. Not the money, the meaning. That's what makes you different from them. He handed me the photograph from the pouch. A young Clara, maybe 20, sitting at the Bösendorfer. Her face turned toward the camera, smiling like she had a secret. I took that on our first anniversary, William said. I want you to keep it. Somewhere you can see it. So Ethan always knows who loved that piano first. I clutched the photograph to my chest. I'll frame it. Put it right beside the piano. Clara can watch over him while he plays. William's voice cracked slightly. She'd like that. She always said music needed witnesses. Ethan examined the key, then walked to the piano. He found the small lock on the fallboard, inserted the key and turned it carefully. Click. The fallboard locked. There, he said quietly. Now it's safe. He unlocked it again, lifted the cover, touched the keys. And now it's ready. We sat together after that, tea cooling in our cups, Ethan playing softly in the background. William's expression shifted from warm to serious. There's something else we need to discuss. About the future. I set down my cup. The house? He nodded. The house now belongs to me, legally, officially. And Richard and Patricia have to leave in 6 weeks. He paused. But that raises a question. What happens to the house after? After? I'm 72, Amanda. Healthy but realistic. That house has been in my family for almost 50 years. Clara and I raised our children there. It holds memories, good and bad. He looked around my small apartment. I don't want it sold to strangers. I don't want it lost. What do you want to happen to it? He looked at me steadily. I want it to stay in the family, the real family. I want it protected the way the piano was protected, and I want you to be part of that protection. I felt the weight of what he was asking. Me? I'd like to put the house in a trust. Like I did with the piano, you would be the beneficiary, Ethan after you. It would be yours to live in, to care for, to pass on. He paused. But protected from certain people. From Richard, from Patricia, from anyone who might try to take it. I stood and walked to the window, looked out at the apartment complex parking lot. The view I'd had for 5 years, small cars, cracked asphalt, a dumpster that was never emptied on time. It was fine, it was safe, but it wasn't home. Behind me, Ethan's playing continued, Clara's nocturne, 3 generations of music in a room too small to hold it. If I accept, I said slowly, what happens to you? William smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. I'd like to come with you, if you'll have me. Live in the house I built with Clara. Watch my great-grandson play her piano. Spend whatever years I have left with the family that matters. My eyes burned. Of course we'll have you. This is what Ethan needs. This is what I need. A real family, in a real home. William stood and crossed to me, took my hands in his. Then it settled. Ethan's playing stopped. He turned on the bench. What settled? I looked at William. He nodded. How do you feel about moving? I asked my son. His eyes widened. Moving where? To Grandpa's house, all 3 of us, together. The smile that spread across Ethan's face was answer enough. When? He asked. 6 weeks, after your other grandparents leave. And Grandpa will live with us and teach me more songs? Every day, William said, as many as you can stand. I can stand a lot. William laughed, a real laugh, young-sounding despite his years. As he gathered his things to leave, he paused at the door. 6 more weeks, then everything changes. He looked at me. Can you hold on that long? I thought about everything we'd survived, the betrayal, the theft, the confrontation, the aftermath. We've held on this long, 6 weeks is nothing. He nodded, satisfied. Then his expression grew serious. Just remember, the hard part isn't over. Your parents won't leave quietly. They'll try everything to change my mind. Let them try. William studied my face. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. That's exactly what Clara would have said. He left, and Ethan returned to the piano. I stood at the window watching William's car pull away. Behind me, Clara's nocturne began again. The music that had survived everything. The music that would survive everything still to come. 6 more weeks. And then, finally, home. Day 60. I woke before the alarm, before the sun, before anything in the world had permission to move. My first thought was today. My second thought was finally. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my apartment for the last time. The hum of the old refrigerator, traffic noise from the street below, a neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. Sounds I wouldn't miss, but sounds I would remember. The apartment had transformed over the past week. Boxes stacked against every wall, second-hand furniture donated or sold. Only essentials remained. Mattresses on the floor, the coffee pot, Ethan's backpack by the door, and the piano. Wrapped in protective blankets, waiting for the movers who would come tomorrow. Today was just about us. About walking into a house that was finally ours. Ethan appeared in my doorway, already dressed. His good shirt, clean pants, hair combed without being asked. "Today's the day," he said. "Today's the day." He looked around the bare apartment. "Are you sad to leave?" I considered the question. 5 years in this space. 5 years of making do. 5 years of telling myself it was enough. "No," I said. "But it feels strange. This was where we lived for a long time." "It was where we lived," Ethan corrected gently. "Home is different." I smiled. "When did you get so smart?" "Grandpa says wisdom skips a generation," he grinned. I think he was insulting someone, but I'm not sure who. My phone buzzed. Andrew Chen's name on the screen. "The property is clear," he said when I answered. "They vacated last night." My heart hammered. "Any issues?" "A few. Nothing that changes your timeline. They tried to take some items that weren't theirs. Furniture William bought decades ago. Appliances that came with the house. We had to clarify ownership." "How did they take that?" "About as well as you'd expect." Patricia argued, cried, threatened. Your father went silent. Melissa and Derek loaded a separate truck. He paused. "They weren't speaking to each other, or to your parents." The family had fractured completely. I felt nothing. "Where did they go?" "Your parents found a 2-bedroom rental across town. First and last month's rent came from your father's retirement account. It was the only money they could access." Another pause. "Melissa and Derek are in separate apartments. The divorce was filed last week." I absorbed this. The empire my parents had built on borrowed foundations collapsed in 60 days. "What condition is the house in?" "Livable, but not pristine. They weren't gentle. Some holes in the walls where they removed fixtures, scuff marks." "Minor damage." Andrew's voice remained neutral. "Nothing structural, mostly spite. William has contractors scheduled for next week." "And the theater?" "Still intact. The equipment was too integrated to remove without destruction. The screen, speakers, seats, all still there." He cleared his throat. "William said you'd know what to do with it." I did know. I'd been thinking about it for weeks. "One more thing," Andrew said. "Patricia left a letter, addressed to you. It was on the kitchen counter." My stomach tightened. "What does it say?" "I didn't read it. Would you like me to?" "No, I'll handle it myself." I wasn't afraid of my mother's words anymore, but I wasn't eager to hear them either. At noon, Ethan and I arrived at Andrew's office. William was already there, sitting in the waiting room. He looked tired but peaceful, the look of a man who had finally set down a weight he'd been carrying for decades. "Are you ready?" he asked. "More than ready." Andrew produced a set of keys, 3 of them, on a simple ring. Front door, back door, garage. The property is officially in the Clara Collins Family Trust. Amanda Collins is named as primary beneficiary and resident trustee. Ethan Collins is the successor beneficiary. He met my eyes. "No one else has any legal claim. Ever." I took the keys. They were heavier than I expected. Or maybe that was just the weight of what they represented. Andrew also handed me an envelope, Patricia's handwriting on the front. Just my name, no dear, no love. You don't have to read it, William said gently. I know, but I will. I opened it right there, in Andrew's office, witness to whatever poison my mother had left behind. Her words were exactly what I expected. I hope you're satisfied now. You've destroyed this family over a piano. Your father's health is ruined. I can't sleep. Melissa won't speak to us. Everything we built, 40 years of family, gone. And for what? So you could feel important for once? You were always jealous of Melissa, always resentful. Now everyone can see it. I don't know how you live with yourself. But I suppose that's your problem now. No signature. No love, Mom. Just bitterness, preserved on paper. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. Well, William asked, she still doesn't understand. She never will. That's not my responsibility anymore. I handed the letter to Andrew. File this, for the record. Proof of who she really is if anyone ever needs it. Ethan had been watching silently. Mom, what did Grandma say? I knelt to his level. She said goodbye, in her own way. Was it mean? It was honest, for the first time, maybe ever. He thought about this. That's something, I guess. That's exactly right. The drive to the house felt different than all the times before. I wasn't visiting, wasn't seeking approval, wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I was coming home. The neighborhood looked the same, neat lawns, mature trees, quiet streets where children used to play. But everything felt different. Because I was different. We pulled into the driveway. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just grown. No construction trucks, no party decorations, no cars lining the street, just a house. My house. Our house. Ethan pressed his face to the window. It's big. Big enough for 3 generations, William said from the back seat. We walked to the front door together. I held the keys. My hand trembled slightly. You should do it, I said to William. This was your home first, he shook his head. It was Clara's home, then ours. Now it's yours. He gestured toward the door. You should be the one to open it. The key slid in smoothly. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, empty rooms, bare walls. The smell of fresh paint where the contractors had already started repairs. But beneath the emptiness, the bones of the house remained. Strong, steady, waiting. Ethan rushed past us, exploring like a scout in new territory. This one can be my room. Look at the backyard. Where's the music room going to be? His voice echoed in the empty spaces. Not lonely echoes, excited ones. I walked slowly through the house, past the kitchen where my mother had ruled, past the living room where I'd never felt welcome, past the hallway with family photos that had never included Ethan. I stopped at the door to the home theater. It was closed. I put my hand on the knob but didn't turn it. What are you going to do with it? William asked from behind me. I have an idea, but I want Ethan to decide. I turned to face him. It was his piano that paid for it. His choice, what happens next. Ethan appeared at my side, drawn by the conversation. There's something I want to show you, I said. Something we need to talk about. I opened the door. The home theater was exactly as I remembered. Leather seats in deep burgundy, massive screen covering the far wall, fiber optic stars twinkling overhead. The Collins cinema banner still hanging, though someone had torn one corner. $97,000 of stolen inheritance. Made physical, made permanent, made ours. Ethan stepped inside slowly. His excitement faded into something more complex. This is what they built, he said quietly, with my piano money. Yes, it's really nice. No anger in his voice, just observation. It is, very nice. What are we going to do with it? I sat down on one of the leather seats, invited him to sit beside me. "We have options," I said. "We could keep it, watch movies together, we could tear it out, make it something else entirely, we could leave it empty, pretend it doesn't exist." Ethan considered each option carefully. Or we could transform it. Into what? The piano needs a proper room, somewhere with good acoustics. Climate control, space to practice and perform. I gestured at the acoustic panels, the soundproofing, the carefully designed space. What if we turned this into a music room? Keep the good parts, replace the screen with windows, make it Clara's room. Ethan's eyes widened. We could do that? We can do anything we want. It's our house now. He stood and walked to the center of the room, turned in a slow circle, seeing it differently. Not as a monument to theft, as raw material for something better. "I want that," he said finally. "Clara's room. I want to play piano where the screen used to be. I want everyone who comes here to know what really matters." William watched from the doorway, eyes glistening. "Clara would love this," he said softly. "Every bit of it. Her piano in a room built to silence her, turned into a room that amplifies her legacy." "That's poetry," I said. "That's justice." My phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Normally I would have ignored it, but something made me answer. "Ms. Collins, this is Margaret Thornton from the Regional Youth Orchestra." My breath caught. Ethan had auditioned 2 weeks ago. A video submission, him playing the Chopin Nocturne on Clara's piano in our small apartment. I'd almost forgotten in the chaos of moving. "I'm calling to let you know that Ethan has been accepted." The words didn't register at first. His audition was exceptional. The panel was very impressed. We'd like to offer him a seat in our junior program. Rehearsals begin next month. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Ms. Collins, are you there?" Yes, I'm here, thank you so much." I hung up and found Ethan watching me, his face cautious. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." I pulled him into my arms. "You got into the orchestra." For a moment he didn't move, then his whole body relaxed, and something that had been held tight for months finally released. "Really? Really? They said your audition was exceptional. They want you to start next month." He hugged me back fiercely. "I did it. I really did it. You did it, baby. All by yourself." William appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "What's all this?" Ethan got into the youth orchestra. His face split into the widest smile I'd ever seen. Clara's great-great-grandson, in a real orchestra. She's definitely bragging up there now. Bragging so loud even the angels are tired of it. That evening, we sat on the floor of the empty living room. Takeout containers between us. The house settling around us, making space for its new family. William set down his chopsticks. "There's something I've been meaning to ask. I mentioned it before, but things were uncertain then. They're not uncertain now." I waited. "I've been in that senior community for almost a year. It's fine, clean, safe, professional." He looked around the empty room. "But it's not home. This is home. Or it was once. I'd like it to be home again." "Grandpa, we've already discussed this. You're welcome here." "I know, but I wanted to ask properly. In this house, where Clara and I started." His voice grew thick. "I want to end here too, with family who actually wants me." I reached over and took his weathered hand. "This house is as much yours as it is ours. You don't have to ask. You never did." Ethan spoke up from his spot on the floor. "Plus, you promised to teach me more songs. You can't do that from the senior place. We need you here. The piano needs you too." William laughed. "Well, if the piano needs me, I suppose I have no choice." I looked at them both, my son and my grandfather, two people who had been overlooked by the same family, finding each other in the wreckage. "When can you move in?" William grinned. "How does tomorrow sound?" "Tomorrow sounds perfect." Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep in his new room on a mattress on the floor, After William had returned to his apartment to pack, I walked through the empty house alone. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. I touched the walls, the door frames, the windows. This was real. This was mine. I'd fought for it, bled for it, lost my old family for it, and gained something better. I paused at the theater door. Soon it would be Clara's room, a music room built from the bones of betrayal. Ethan would play there, William would listen, and Clara's piano would finally be where it belonged. My phone lit up with a message from the orchestra. Ethan's first performance is scheduled for 6 months from now. Families are encouraged to attend. I smiled in the darkness. 6 months. By then, the house would be complete. The music room finished. My son would take the stage with Clara's blessing and William's teaching, and for the first time in 3 generations, a Collins would perform for a family that actually showed up. I walked back to my room and lay down on the mattress, listening to the silence of my new home. Tomorrow, William would arrive with his boxes and his memories and his lifetime of love for a woman who had wanted only one thing, for her piano to find someone who would hear it. Tomorrow, a new life would begin. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. 6 months can change everything. 6 months can heal wounds you thought would never close. 6 months can turn a house into a home and strangers into family and silence into music. I woke to the sound of piano, the way I did every morning now. Not practicing scales, not exercises, real music. Chopin's Nocturne floating up the stairs like it had been doing for generations, like Clara herself was playing somewhere just out of sight. But it wasn't Clara. It was Ethan, my son. 10 years old now, his birthday celebrated last month with a small party in our backyard. Just William, a few friends from school, and a cake shaped like piano keys. No relatives from my side, no awkward silences. No one looking through him like he wasn't there. It was perfect. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The backyard looked different now. William had planted a garden where the construction debris used to pile up, tomatoes, peppers, herbs Clara used to grow. He said it helped him feel close to her. The music room was visible from here, too, where the home theater used to be. We'd torn out the massive screen and replaced it with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. The leather seats were donated to a community center. The fiber optic stars dismantled and discarded. In their place stood Clara's piano, the Bosendorfer, 131 years old and more beautiful than ever. Today was the day. Ethan's first performance with the Regional Youth Orchestra. 6 months of rehearsals, 6 months of preparation, 6 months of watching my son transform from a quiet boy who made himself small into a young musician who took up exactly as much space as he deserved. I found William in the kitchen, already dressed in his best suit. The same charcoal gray he'd worn to the confrontation. The same one he'd worn to Clara's funeral. He said it was his lucky suit now. "Nervous?" I asked. He smiled. "Terrified. You?" "Same." We laughed together. The easy laugh of people who had survived something and come out stronger on the other side. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his formal concert attire making him look older than 10. White shirt, black pants, polished shoes, his hair combed carefully, the way William had taught him. "I'm ready," he said. William stood and crossed to him, adjusted his collar, straightened his shoulders. "Clara would be so proud of you," he said. "I'm so proud of you." "What if I mess up?" "Then you'll keep playing. That's what musicians do. The music doesn't stop for mistakes. It carries them forward and makes them part of the story." Ethan nodded slowly. "Grandpa, will you sit in the front row?" "I wouldn't sit anywhere else." The concert hall was larger than I expected. Rows of velvet seats stretching back into shadow. A stage lit with warm spotlights. The smell of polished wood and anticipation. Families filled the seats around us. Parents with cameras. Grandparents with programs clutched in nervous hands. Siblings squirming with boredom they'd regret later when they understood what they were witnessing. William and I sat in the front row, exactly as promised. 2 seats on the aisle, reserved for family. I noticed a familiar face a few rows back, Andrew Chen, in a suit slightly less formal than usual. He caught my eye and nodded. A small gesture, an acknowledgement. He'd come to watch. The lawyer who had made all of this possible. The man who had turned William's careful planning into legal reality. He was here to see the result. "I didn't know Andrew was coming," I whispered to William. "I invited him." William's voice was thick. He should see what he helped create. The lights dimmed. The audience hushed. A woman in a black dress walked onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the Regional Youth Orchestra's spring concert. I barely heard her words. My eyes were fixed on the wings of the stage, where I could just make out the young musicians waiting for their cue. And then they walked out. 23 children between the ages of 8 and 14, violins and cellos and flutes and clarinets. And there, walking to the grand piano at the center of the stage, was Ethan, my son. My heart stopped beating, or maybe it beat so fast I couldn't feel the individual pulses anymore. He sat at the bench, adjusted the height, placed his hands in his lap, looked out at the audience with an expression I'd never seen before. Confidence. Real confidence. Not the performance of it, the thing itself. The conductor raised her baton. The music began. Ethan's solo came in the third piece. An arrangement of Chopin's Nocturne, the same piece Clara had taught William, the same piece William had taught Ethan. The piece that had traveled through 4 generations of our family like a river finding its way to the sea. When his fingers touched the keys, I stopped breathing. The notes filled the concert hall, rich and deep and resonant. The same notes I'd heard 1,000 times in our living room, in our small apartment, in my parents' house before everything fell apart. But different now, amplified by the space, witnessed by hundreds of strangers who had no idea what this music meant. Beside me, William wept silently, tears streaming down his weathered face. His hand found mine and squeezed. I wept too, couldn't help it, didn't try to stop it. This was my son. The boy who had learned to be small. The boy who had blamed himself for being robbed. The boy who had whispered, "Did Grandpa change his mind in an empty room where his piano used to be?" That boy was gone. In his place sat a young musician, playing his great-great-grandmother's piece on a stage in front of people who had actually shown up, playing with confidence and joy and the absolute certainty that he belonged there. When the piece ended, the applause was immediate, enthusiastic, real. Ethan stood and bowed. His eyes found us in the front row, found William still crying, found me still crying. He smiled, the biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. And then he did something unexpected. He walked to the microphone at the edge of the stage. The conductor looked surprised, but didn't stop him. "I want to thank someone," Ethan said. His voice was clear and steady. "My great-grandfather William, he taught me this piece, and he taught me something else too." The audience was silent, waiting. "He taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up, who listens, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself." I pressed my hand to my mouth. This piece was written by Chopin, but in my family we call it Clara's song, because my great-great-grandmother played it every night for 60 years, and now I get to play it too. Ethan looked directly at William. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." The applause that followed was thunderous. Standing ovation. From strangers who had just learned something true about love and family and what it means to show up. William stood too, raised his hand to his great-grandson. A salute between generations. I stood beside him, crying too hard to clap, but clapping anyway. After the concert, we found Ethan backstage. He was surrounded by other young musicians, all of them buzzing with post-performance energy. But when he saw us, he broke away and ran. I caught him in my arms and held him tight. "You were amazing," I said into his hair. "So amazing. I didn't mess up, not once. You were perfect," William joined the embrace. 3 generations holding each other in the wings of a concert hall, surrounded by music stands and instrument cases and the lingering echo of Chopin. Andrew Chen appeared at the edge of our circle. Ethan looked up and recognized him. "Mr. Chen, you came!" I wouldn't have missed it. Andrew's usual professional reserve had cracked slightly. He looked almost moved. "That was beautiful, Ethan. Truly. Thank you for helping get my piano back." "Thank your grandfather. I just did the paperwork." William shook Andrew's hand. "Stay for dinner? Amanda's cooking." Andrew hesitated, then smiled. "I'd like that." We drove home as the sun was setting, golden light streaming through the windows. Ethan in the back seat, still in his concert clothes, humming the nocturne under his breath. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something in the mailbox. An envelope, cream-colored, familiar handwriting. Patricia. I pulled it out and looked at it for a long moment. My mother's handwriting, my name on the front. No return address, but I knew. "What is it?" William asked. "A card, from my mother." "Are you going to open it?" I thought about it. Turned the envelope over in my hands. Felt the weight of whatever words she'd chosen to send. Then I walked to the trash can by the garage and dropped it in. Unopened, unread, irrelevant. "Some messages don't need to be received," I said. William nodded slowly. "Clara would approve." Inside, the house was warm and welcoming. The smell of the meal I'd prepared earlier, keeping warm in the oven. Flowers on the table, photos on the walls, photos of Ethan at his recitals, photos of William and Clara on their wedding day, photos of a family that had chosen each other. We ate together. Amanda, Ethan, William, and Andrew Chen. An unlikely group bound by circumstance and choice, and the belief that justice sometimes actually arrives. After dinner, Ethan asked to be excused. He walked to the music room, to Clara's room, and sat at the piano. The evening light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It caught the black lacquer of the Bösendorfer and made it glow. He began to play. Not the nocturne, something new. Something I didn't recognize. "What is that?" I asked William. His eyes were soft. "Something he's been working on, his own composition." "He wrote it?" "Clara started composing when she was about his age, too." I stood in the doorway of the music room, watching my son create something that had never existed before. His small hands moving across the keys with confidence and purpose, his face calm, present, whole. Andrew came to stand beside me. "You did a good thing," he said quietly, fighting for him. "I should have done it sooner. You did it when it mattered. That's what counts." William joined us. 3 adults watching a child play piano in a room built from the wreckage of betrayal. A room that had been designed to silence and suppress, transformed into a space for creation and joy. "What happens now?" I asked. William smiled. "Now we live. That's all any of us can do. Live and love and show up for the people who matter." Ethan's composition swelled and softened and found its ending. He lifted his hands from the keys and turned to look at us. "Mom, can I invite my friends to hear me play sometime? Like here, in Clara's room?" I thought about all the times he'd asked permission just to exist. All the times he'd made himself small to avoid causing trouble. All the times he'd assumed his needs were less important than everyone else's comfort. "You can invite anyone you want," I said. "You can invite the whole world if you want." He smiled. That bright, unguarded smile I'd seen for the first time at the concert. "Maybe not the whole world, but maybe a few people." "That sounds perfect." The sun finished setting. The music room glowed with the last light of the day. And somewhere, I was certain, Clara was listening. I walked into the room and sat beside my son on the piano bench. William lowered himself into the chair we'd placed near the window, the chair where he sat every evening to listen. "Play me something," I said to Ethan. "What do you want to hear?" "Anything, everything, whatever you want to play." His fingers found the keys again. A new melody, something soft and hopeful and entirely his own. I closed my eyes and listened. This was what I'd been fighting for. Not the piano, though the piano mattered. Not the house, though the house was finally home. Not even justice, though justice had been served. I'd been fighting for this moment. For my son to play without fear. For my grandfather to listen without grief. For a family that showed up, that listened, that fought for each other when it mattered. Some people never understand what family is supposed to mean. My parents never did. They saw family as ownership, as obligation, as a hierarchy of importance with themselves at the top. But family is something else entirely. Family is choice. Family is presence. Family is the people who sit in the front row and cry when you succeed. The music faded. Ethan looked up at me. "Mom, are you happy?" I put my arm around him and pulled him close. Happier than I've ever been. He leaned into me, warm and solid and real. Me too. Outside the windows, stars were beginning to appear. The same stars Clara had watched through this same window decades ago. The same stars that had witnessed everything our family had been through. They would witness everything still to come. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on its own. Sometimes you have to stand up and demand it. Sometimes you have to fight for the people who can't fight for themselves, even when the people you're fighting against are your own blood. I fought for my son. My grandfather fought for his great-grandson. And together, we built something new from the ashes of something broken. So, what do you think? Did my grandfather go too far when he took back the house? Or did my parents get exactly what they deserved? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight for someone you love, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and doing what's right, I hope you'll like this video and subscribe to our channel. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories about family and betrayal, and the kind of justice that doesn't come from courts, but from the people who refuse to stay silent. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, the people who truly love you will always show up. The rest are just strangers who happen to share your blood. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.